Welcome to Focus and Flow for Teachers. I'm Mark Spring, founder of Synergy Creative Learning Solutions, Living Lexicon, and Focus and Flow. It is my honor and privilege to partner with you today in a discussion of how we can make especially challenging classrooms turn into highly functional, focused classrooms where every student gets a great chance to learn at his or her own pace, and where teachers can fulfill their intentions to serve their students with the best of their hearts and the best of their knowledge. This method that we're talking about today helped me to transform one of the most difficult classrooms I faced, and then for years going forward, never to face the kind of intense disruption that made teaching feel almost impossible, and that helped me get back to feeling the deep joy and the satisfaction of deep communication between myself and my students and one another, my students and myself. This method can also help you to serve your principal more effectively so that your principal can worry less about behavioral management and referrals and more about fulfilling the school's academic mission. If you are a teacher who has experienced anxiety or depression or a racing heart rate or questions about whether or not you're a fit for the classroom at all because of the challenges you face from students, you have a lot of company around the country. And that company includes people who are extremely well-trained, passionate about education, and idealistic about the sharing of ideas from one generation to the next. I've created a Focus and Flow module for teachers, administrators, and restorative practice coordinators and counselors, so that working from each angle of leadership within the building, whole teams can collaborate to improve the climate and performance throughout the building on a day-to-day basis, year-long. But even one person working with this method in a classroom or in a counseling room or from a principal's office can bring significant improvement starting on day one of application. I've made this module both as detailed and as concise as I can, so that by the time you've completed this training, you will be able to apply this method effectively from your first attempt and on through the weeks and months to come. If you would like to talk about how you could tune the ideas you've learned here to your particular style and your particular school and population, I'd be very happy to work with you. So please feel free to contact me at the email that you can see here displayed in the module. I'd be happy to arrange an online meeting with you or with your team, or even to make an in-person site visit so that we could dive deeply and share observations and learn face-to-face together. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share with you an idea that transformed my classroom and, in fact, my career in life. And I hope that it can do the same for you. We need a Focus and Flow solution because of all the pressures that teachers face every day, pressures that work against one another and pull teachers exhaustingly in different directions. What you can see here on the screen is a brief description of 12 pressures that inspire teachers, that prompt them to worry, and that occupy our thoughts typically around the clock. And that's why I put 12 here, one for each hour on the clock face. Let's start by looking at the 12 o'clock position, elicit attention. In order to create any kind of progress in learning, teachers must be able to elicit consistent flowing attention from students to delve into content. And what hundreds of thousands of teachers minimally around the country know is that eliciting attention from some groups of students is practically impossible. And all of the other conflicts that we'll describe in this program flow essentially from this problem. And so let's go a little bit more deeply into this. Let's look down at the 8 o'clock position, recover lost time. If we're going to help students to overcome the achievement gap, for example, or any kind of significant gap in learning where students are behind grade level status in reading and math, then time on task is of the essence. This reinforces the need for us to elicit attention. Okay, and then another incentive, let's go to the 11 o'clock position and look at help the families. Parents want and need their children to attend safe, focused classes so that their children can become independent, skillful, and knowledgeable. And we teachers answer to this call to action and service. But this is where our efforts to then elicit attention become problematic. We need to deal with interference coming from students who prevent that attention from flowing into the learning process. And so we need to, let's look at the 1 o'clock position. We need to be strong. But here's where we face so many complications. We can't be too strong. If we're disciplinarian, then that approach can harm class morale and trust. However, if we are too lax or hesitant in our approach to steering a class, this too can harm trust. And it diminishes time for learning, thus failing to recover lost time and failing to help the families. And let's look at the 9 o'clock position, failing to move the needle in a positive direction with respect to high stakes testing. We know the pressure here. State, district, and schools all drive for growth and proficiency as measured by these test scores. And that growth absolutely requires steady engagement, attention, and retained learning. Teachers know this, principals know this, but this is where teachers start to feel even more pressure about eliciting attention. And then the need to do something about it when people interfere with that attention flowing into the learning process. So we've got to be strong. And sometimes this means that we call for support from administration. Now here is where it gets very complicated. Let's look at the 10 o'clock position, lower reporting. Administrators feel enormous pressure from upper administration at the district and state level to lower behavioral referrals and get more teacher-led management of classroom behaviors. Some teachers even argue that principals will ignore or lightly manage discipline in such a way that it doesn't make any kind of impact, just leaves the teacher on an island to deal with classroom chaos. And this is a source of real division between many teachers and administrators in distraction-prone schools. And this is one of the key pressures that the focus and flow method helps teachers and administrators to successfully address. This is one of the reasons why I so strongly advocate for this program. So, if administrators feel that they risk their own jobs and reputations by doing too much to back up the teachers in their complaints and requests for help in classroom management, then teachers are really going to have to find an answer. And this answer can be impossible to reach. And yet there's another force here that asks for the teacher to use more restraint in bringing the class to focus rigorously on academics. Let's look at the 2 o'clock position, stop the school to prison pipeline. Teachers want to help disruptive students remain in the classroom rather than getting them to serve suspensions and lose ground, or even start on a possible pathway to institutional discipline. This is a major problem. And this is another motivation that drives teachers and makes them ambivalent about entering behavioral referrals into the system. Okay, so insofar as teachers manage to do that, it's extremely positive. And yet, problematically, it then means that we aren't putting as much attention on the learning process and we aren't recovering that lost time in terms of skills. And so the conflict deepens. There are still other pressures here, and let's at least take time to mention them. The pressure of differentiation, the desire and need to plan, to serve students at many different levels of speed, complexity, and endurance as learners requires a teacher to be many teachers at once. And this is also true behaviorally. So this method also helps to address this pressure and this kind of exciting prospect to think that we could, in fact, differentiate very effectively in a highly diverse classroom. Materials and money. We need to find and choose materials that engage students and at the same time meet school, district, state, and cultural standards and norms. And then we need to afford this material. This is a very complicated challenge for teachers. But one thing I like about the focus and flow method is that it is not expensive. Teachers just need to get a good microphone, and then the software for recording is free. And the change that flows from that small investment is so profound, it's worth it. All right, now let's look at these bottom three here, the 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock issues. Staying motivated and idealistic. When teachers are managing all of the pressures we've discussed so far in this module, it's very hard to do this. It's very hard to keep classes performing at a high level without it taking a notable health and social effect, without it exacting a cost for a teacher. And this is a really personal challenge to manage. We know this. The time spent every night, the time spent on weekends to try and hold everything together for the benefit of the students and the families is so pressing that teachers drive themselves beyond their limits. And in this context, teachers are challenged to stir their motivation, not lose it, and to live their ideals rather than to abandon them. And this program is also designed to help teachers do just that. Let's look at 6 o'clock. Teachers need to keep the high road. And this is also just part of the cost and the emotional labor that goes into teaching in disruption-prone classrooms. We've got charismatic students. They've got a ton of personality. Some of them are really funny. And they disrupt class and they undermine learning. And they are often competing for and winning center stage in the classroom, at least for a time. And it's hard to compete with such students on a daily basis when you've got to play by different rules. You need to win attention on adult professional terms. And meanwhile, a contest for competition, it's always looming. And that's very stressful, but we've got to keep the high road. This method that I'm talking about you today will help you do that. And then steady stress relief. And this goes beyond the classroom, but let's just acknowledge it here. The amount and intensity of the work required to prepare for, lead, and evaluate classes of students requires consistent and effective self-care on the part of all teachers. And this is especially the case if classes are very stressful. And so there is a teacher wellness journey program that I am also offering through Synergy Creative Learning Solutions. But I would just encourage you for a moment to think about what it is that you do for yourself to help yourself come back to a feeling of centeredness and peace. And whatever you do to do that, I'd like to just say thank you and encourage you to keep finding that wellspring of renewal from your hikes in the woods, your Pilates, your yoga, your running, your weightlifting, your sports, your coaching, whatever it is. Keep going in this direction. It brings great energy to your classroom as well. Okay, so I think that we have looked at all of the issues here, the core issues that teachers face and that occupy teachers' minds round the clock. So what do we do next then, once we have acknowledged all these pressures? How does this method that I've been describing help? Well, let's look at these issues, all 12, and briefly look at how the method helps. For one thing, here's how it helps the families. This method provides every student with a focused class every day and 24/7 access to material. This makes a big difference for the families because then they know they can send their children into classrooms that function. Second, on eliciting attention. The method I'm going to be describing in depth today helps teachers to wall out distraction, but even more so, it helps teachers to win attention without conflict, without having to lean into discipline. For me, this is one of the most exciting outcomes of using this method. Now, how does it help a teacher be strong but not too strong? Well, here's how. The teacher and the recorded versions of that teacher outnumber students. There's plenty of help on the job here. So there's no need for a teacher to raise his or her voice or their voice, because in a classroom of 30 students, there will essentially be 31 teachers. And if you have enough recordings, those 31 teachers can speak about different topics at different speeds and volumes all of the time, and this can be done easily. And this is a very exciting part of this program that I would like to help you master. Okay, let's go forward to the next set of 3 issues. Differentiation. How does this method help teachers to be successful in differentiation? Well, students can control the pace, the volume, the privacy, the stimulation level of each repeatable, high-quality interactive lesson. And the teacher can run different lessons for each student too, concurrently, with lots of attention to detail and instructions and support. And the teacher can do that with ease and without any distraction that separates one group from another, or that pulls one different group off of their task as they hear the teacher interacting with another group. It's remarkably effective in helping differentiation to be a concrete part of every class every day, if that's what the teacher needs and desires. Materials and money. Here's what you need to run this program. You need your voice, and you need free recording software. You need a good microphone. That could be anywhere from, say, $30 to $150. And your passion for your subject. Okay, now beyond that, you need the typical materials and money you need for your curriculum. You need your science lab materials. You need your math materials, calculators. You need books. I think if you're a teacher, you need real books. A lot of research today shows, and I'll list this research in this program for you to look into it for yourself. But reading paper books helps attention to flow more deeply for students, which helps comprehension as well. It's just a healthier pursuit. There are less distractions built into a paper book than into reading from a computer. Okay. Staying motivated and idealistic. How's this program help there? Well, this method eases a teacher's burden while enabling a teacher to carry actually a much larger load every single day over the long haul. And so what that means is that this method opens a pathway for major progress, social and emotional and academic. And a teacher can use this advantage to make a difference now and tomorrow. And the fact of that supports motivation and idealism. All right, let's talk about how this method helps teachers keep the high road. The method ends contests of will. And how does it do that? By removing the stage. See, there's a triad of disruptive students, and a teacher, and an audience. The disruptive students need the audience in order to conduct the contest. This method eliminates the audience, and so it removes the stage. And when you've removed the stage as the teacher, composure and compassion will come so much more easily in that circumstance, because your plan's going forward, and then you can meet with those kids who want to disrupt. You can meet them on a much quieter, calmer level. And this is good news for everyone. How does it help teachers get steady stress relief? This method reduces stress enormously. It amplifies the fun you can have both in planning and in leading lessons. It enables striving. You're striving and the students is striving, and it gets results. I think that's pretty stress relieving. How does it help with high stakes testing? Well, this method supports a daily culture of attention in your classroom. And attention is the elusive but must-have condition for academic growth. In any classroom, especially in disruption-prone classrooms, you can get attention every day for the very large majority of time in your class with this method. And again, at no additional cost except the cost of your microphone. It's extraordinary. Last, but certainly not least in importance, how does this method help teachers and students to recover lost time? Well, the time on task feature of this method, as well as the quality of skill and content coaching this method enables, gives students behind grade level a daily chance to recover and gain ground. I'm speaking to you from experience. This happens. How does it help teachers to actually report fewer behavioral problems? Helping take pressure off administrators. Well, here's how. Well, since this method removes the stage where contests of will usually take place, teachers can send fewer behavior referrals, and the reason is that there will be fewer behavioral incidents. It's quite remarkable the change that this brings to student behavior. All right, now how does this help to stop the school to prison pipeline? Well, teachers will find it far easier not only to keep disruptive students in the room because they can't disrupt anymore, but also to help those students in smaller groups and in one-to-one situations while the recorded lesson goes on uninterrupted in the rest of the class. Vulnerable students in this method can get really deep help, and everyone can focus. And this is what this method did for me with my most disruptive and charismatic students. It helped them slow down with me and trust the situation and show themselves a different side to me. And it's a repeatable result. All right, so we've just talked about how this method can help teachers address their perceived pressures in disruption-prone classrooms. Let's look now at how we do this. We look at this slide here, that teachers can and must replicate themselves. And this is the essential argument This is the essential principle of focus and flow that I'm asking you to consider and find ways to use in your classroom. Teachers can use technology to amplify their presence and add energy to their classrooms while doing so much less discipline. And here we have a figure of the teacher there at the center, surrounded by the replicas of him or herself or themselves, if we're talking about plural teachers. And we have here, let me see, I think it's 24 copies. Yes. So this would be in a classroom of, say, 24 students. There are 25 teachers there then. 24 recorded versions in interactive lessons, and then the live version of the teacher who can combine student groups in all kinds of ways and hold those groups more stable. Replicating oneself enables a teacher to be available 24/7. Also, if your students are absent, if they miss school, your recorded interactive lesson and the materials, if they're paper materials especially or digital, they're available all around the clock. Oh, this is also going to help you reduce how many times you repeat yourself during the day, something I'll get back to later. And this increases and improves your service every day and all year, and it reduces stress for you and for your students. What does this bring about then as a change? It positions at the center of this circle of pressures a teacher supported by this digital structure every day, all of the time, which will help you, the teacher, to address each one of these pressures independently and much more effectively all the time. You can elicit attention, for example, so much more easily with this method. And that helps you to address all of the other pressures described here on this graphic. When I use this method, I didn't use visuals. I only use audio recordings as a basis for pointing my students into classical activities, reading paper-based books, writing quite often by hand, but also typing, and then having conversations based on that activity. It was very satisfying. It was very effective in getting behavioral referrals almost eliminated, producing extraordinary academic growth, and creating a very positive classroom and school climate. You can do the same. I'm not so different from teachers around this country. My students were not so different from students around this country. It's just that we communicated differently. This method makes that possible for you as well. And I wish you the best in this endeavor. Excited to get into a discussion with you about the details of how you operate the focus and flow method in your classroom. First, I'd like to look at what it is that we want to happen in our classrooms, to set for ourselves a goal toward which we can work every day in using the focus and flow method. And to frame this conversation, I'd like to introduce a definition of happiness given to us by the positive psychologists, particularly Dr. Martin Seligman, who has founded the modern positive psychology movement and has given us this definition of PERMA-V. So this is an acronym, and let's go through what each one of these letters represents. Happiness, according to Seligman and the positive psychologist, begins with positive emotions. Now let's think for a moment. In a disruption-prone classroom, how often are you and the students experiencing positive emotions, especially shared positive emotions that derive from a common understanding of the value of what you're doing? I think this is something that quite often lacks in our disruption-prone classrooms, and this is part of what injures us and stresses us in these situations. But we want to go for this. We should keep this on the table and reset the tone of our classrooms and go for positive emotion, even when our classrooms are struggling. This method enables us to go for that and to strive safely for it. Okay, we'll talk more about that, and I need to prove that point to you today. But let's go forward for now and look at the second letter, engagement. When we're engaged, our attention is not forced, it is drawn out of us. It is a process that shows in how we are physically attuned to the task at hand. For example, if we're reading a book, we're not thinking about the fact that we're sitting in a chair for 30, 45, 60 minutes at a time or longer. We are in the world of the activity. And it's this kind of engagement that we want to elicit in our students. And the focus and flow method helps to win student engagement on a consistent basis. All right, well, how about relationships? Positive relationships. This is a third and perhaps most important dimension in PERMA. And we teachers and our administrative colleagues and restorative practice counselors speak all the time about the centrality of the relationship to the teacher-student exchange. And this focus and flow method will help teachers step in every day with confidence that that relationship can start from a baseline of positivity. Your replicated selves are going to do incredible work with each individual student, and you can know that. And that changes your frame of mind and energy going in every day. And the students know it too. Those who want to get around distraction and get a real education, they'll come in feeling lighter and happier because they know that they're going to get that chance. And then the students who do want to disrupt, well, they actually get a chance to work with you on more of a one-on-one and a small group basis. And they're in a calmer situation. And this helps them have a different relationship to learning and to you as well. This method helps get the R part of PERMA going in the right direction. Meaning. Well, the thing that lacks perhaps most of all in disruption-prone classrooms is a shared sense of the meaning of what you're doing. If you're constantly interrupted as the teacher, you don't really have any chance to help students appreciate all the subtleties of meaning and their power and importance in students' lives in the future if you can't have that conversation. Your chance of establishing a shared sense of meaning and a quest with students deepens greatly in the structure that you create through the focus and flow method. Let's look at the next factor in PERMA, accomplishment. Well, when we were talking about pressures that students and teachers face, we looked at high stakes testing. This method is excellent for helping students get a concrete sense of positive accomplishment on those kinds of measures, for example, but also on other ones that students might value even more deeply, like the accomplishment of reading an entire novel and every page of it, answering hundreds of questions about it, and developing the endurance to do that. This makes students feel really proud of themselves, and it helps them develop a positive identity as a student. It's hard to overstate the value of this. So let's look at the last element in PERMA V, which is vitality, health. This is a very significant dimension of the Focus and Flow program. Day on day and week on week, if you can come in and have positive connections with your students that get the job done in concerning academic growth while also lowering behavioral referrals, well, instead of feeling that gut-roiling, heart-pounding stress, you, the teacher, are going to feel health. You're going to feel calmness. You're going to feel pride and energy and hope. And your students are going to feel this as well because they are safely navigating the world of their learning process at their own paces. You are encouraging that. They're not seeing you drawn into conflict and into intense states of exasperated pleading with students or authoritarian stances trying to win attention. They're going to see you regulating things capably and calmly. And they're going to appreciate that, and they're going to be healthier for it too. When we get all of these things together, positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and vitality, then we are experiencing a wonderful learning environment and all the things that it can do for us every day. And we teachers need to think about PERMA V and how we help it to live in our classrooms and in our schools. And I'm offering this instrument here as a way for you to reflect, even if just to yourself, about where things stand right now in your classroom. And then you could look at this day to day or even week to week and track your progress and keep this on your dashboard as a way of tracking the progress that you're making in using focus and flow. Because focus and flow can help you to improve all 6 of these dimensions of happiness as defined to us by the positive psychologists. Okay, let's start to set the stage now for how it is that we bring about focus and flow in our disruption-prone classrooms. Let's take a look here at a classroom vulnerable distraction. Doesn't look very exciting, does it? Probably doesn't look very exciting to these students either. Here we have a situation where there are 30 students in the room, and we see their 30 desks arranged rather plainly. And of course, this is a very distraction and disruption prone situation set up, because even one person calling out loud enough to reach the attention of the 29 others is going to stop the flow of what you're trying to do if you're leading a group activity. Okay, so then why not group them into halves? Here we have a group of 15 and a group of 15 on the other side, and you, the teacher, might note, well, that went a little bit better. This team of 15 focused quite well. They seem to have good chemistry. This other group of 15, well, it didn't do so well, but at least I had half the class working well. Well, that's an improvement, but it's still not what we want. All right, let's try another arrangement where we have maybe 3 groups of 10, or perhaps we have pairing and sharing going on in 3 sets of 10. Well, this might still be even a little bit better. You might get more pairs driving their learning processes forward, but this is still difficult to do. And even if you go to groups of 4 or groups of 2, this is the problem. In a classroom vulnerable to distraction, in any desk arrangement, competing voices disrupt and often dominate. And so your grouping strategies, while in some cases helpful, are always exposed to this risk. And going into the class, you, the teacher, you know it. And so do all of the students. And your relationship to one another can come to be dominated by this fact. And that puts a very low ceiling on what you can accomplish together. Well, what we want instead might look something like this. We have the same 30 students, and we even have the same rather lame desk arrangement. And yet what we have is a classroom with no center. We have a classroom where every desk is the front of the classroom. Each desk is a center of activity. And at each of these desks, there is a replication of you in an interactive lesson where students lose themselves in that world you've created in advance, and then you can join yourself as teacher to them as individuals or as small groups throughout the whole process, or you can rotate groups in a recording and in a live session with you. Now, in this situation, the world of sense and sound is controlled by each individual. The spell of the recorded voice, that's your recorded voice, it walls out distraction, but more importantly, tunes attention to content. It facilitates focus. It enables students to make tangible progress on learning, and this gains positive momentum. And when we do this, we get the classroom that we work to create. We get a classroom where students can step in and expect to be the director at a center of activity every day, where we start to experience the dimensions of PERMA. And this is what we want. And of course, this is so different from what happens in a classroom where a teacher has to stand alone and face all of these pressures that we've been discussing in isolation. When we get the teacher who has made replicas of a lesson, of a personality really, in an interactive lesson, then we place a very, very different kind of resource in the classroom, and in a way we place a different kind of teacher in the classroom to face these pressures effectively. Now let's look at how it is specifically that we make this focus and flow method work. Let's get into the details. So teachers, I'd like now to model how it is that this method we've been discussing can work for you in your classroom. Now, the assumption is that you have created a recorded lesson, making it interactive so that students can immerse themselves in a challenging activity that they can control by pausing, by stopping, by rewinding, and giving themselves a chance to get a foothold in understanding content that then enables them to go on and do some problem solving or do some creating of some kind. Getting your students to do this continuously, hour after hour and day on day and week on week, is the key to academic growth. I have my computer right here, and there's a recording that let's pretend that you created, and I'm going to be listening to it while all kinds of distraction goes on in the classroom surround. But I'm going to be wearing this pair of headphones here. And that's going to do two things. One, it's going to function a little bit like earplugs in that it will create a barrier to distraction. But earplugs don't work perfectly, of course, because distraction still leaks in. They're a little bit uncomfortable, and they're not offering anything to us in the way of content. However, the headphones create that walling out effect of the earplugs while also giving us a drawing in effect because the content that's well created is flowing through them. Now, let's begin this demonstration. So you can see that I'm prepared. I have an excellent book that you've chosen to share with us for this lesson, and I have my headphones positioned. So I'm going to start concentrating as you intended for me to do when I entered class today. And then at the same time, all kinds of, in this case, beautiful distraction will be going all around me, but I'll still be able to concentrate on what you've prepared. Let's begin. Now you might be hearing a viola and an orchestra playing Telemann, but I can't hear that. I'm immersed in this mesmerizing passage from Wallace Stevens. Let's read it. While you're hearing this is what I'm hearing. Inexplicable sister of the Minotaur, enigma and mask, although I am part of what is real, hear me and recognize me as part of the unreal. I am the truth, but the truth of that imagination of life, in which with unfamiliar motion and manner you guide me, in those exchanges of speech, in which your words are mine, mine yours. This is from The Necessary Angel, one of Wallace Stevens' many captivating writings. This gives an indication, this model we just completed, of how focus and flow can bring your students into deeper grooves of concentration, in spite of rather powerful distraction going on in their midst. This is what we need in order to appeal to our students for concentration without needing to resort to discipline, which after all turns out to be only moderately effective. If we're constantly leaning into a strained conversation with an exasperated tone to try and elicit concentration from our students, we're not winning that battle. We're just waging a fight that stresses out everyone. So how can we do it? How can we elicit focus and conversation across the classroom without having to fight as hard for it? And this is the way. We simply create a world unto itself, well-designed, captivating, drawing the students' attention into the content again and again without any added willpower on the part of yourself. You took care of that the night before or the week before, or your colleagues who were creating recordings and then shared this one with you. That was where the work happened. And it happened in a state of creativity where you summoned into yourself good energy and trust and humor and personality, and then share that with your audience. And that's where your students connect with you in a different way. So this is what happens. You give your students a chance every day to have hope of completing a lesson, completing a short story, finishing a set of poems, going through a set of questions and answering them to satisfaction, getting the exercise that leads to growth. And with that expectation, everything changes. The emotional tone of the classroom changes, the body language of the classroom changes, and the social interactions change. They improve. They proceed from a baseline of positive expectations, where conflict, if it needs to occur, can occur calmly. Let's say that a student does decide to be disruptive. Most of the students won't be able to hear that person. So you, the teacher, can handle this with the expectation that things will go on as you hoped. And then you can spend time with whatever that person might need. It might be something very important. You can attend to it knowing that your class plan goes forward. Now, this was a key for transforming some of the most difficult classrooms I've worked in a 22-year career. It wasn't that I was so different from other teachers around the country or that my students were different from other groups around the nation. It's just that we relied upon a different method of sharing that made possible a much more pleasing and effective form of interaction that led to much deeper learning. In fact, that propelled students into the top brackets in the state of North Carolina's growth categories in both English and social studies. And I don't think that this result is terribly surprising, given that over a 4.5 month period, students read every word on 1,000 pages of literature, answering over 200 questions that I designed for that 1,000 pages of reading, in addition to writing exercises that sparked students' imagination and analytical thinking, leading to more complicated efforts like hours-long debates that teams of students conducted in competition with one another. This is growth activity, and we got it day on day after formerly being a very dysfunctional classroom. Why? Well, not necessarily because students meant ill toward me or toward one another, but because they were so drawn into the social interactions that engaged them that they walled out the possibility of diving into literature, which is harder to do and which requires long spells of attention. Teachers, if you want to bring your students into long spells of attention, you're not going to do that if you have to stop your class every few minutes or even every 10 minutes or so to try and bring everyone back on task. The spell of flow is already broken. And to reintroduce it and get people back into a state of concentration can take a lot of energy. And if you're stuck there, your class isn't going to achieve growth. And you aren't going to win by being more powerful or more stern. That's only going to stress you out more. So before we turn again to look at some notes that you want to take about how you can use this method for your classroom, let's consider one more point. If you're teaching 4, 5, or even 6 classes a day, you're going into each class with an effort to repeat yourself clearly in a way that fairly represents the content evenly to each group. And after you dispense this stardust throughout the entire day, it's gone. It's not recorded, it's not preserved. If you had students who are absent, they didn't see it, they didn't hear it. If your students weren't paying attention, even though you were right there in their midst, they didn't get it. So the challenge of teaching involves so many things, one of them being that we need to repeat ourselves endlessly, almost every single day. This technique puts an end to that. You can go into each classroom and with your recorded self, doing excellent planned work in leading an interaction with each individual student, with no center of the classroom, there being every single desk a center of student activity in a world unto itself. You then can go and pair yourself to those worlds. You can pull your students off in small groups. You can hold discussions without distracting anyone. And you're having a creative experience with each unique group while they are getting a depth of content on a consistent basis that gives your students a deep chance to journey into a whole novel, into a short story collection, into a weeks-long debate preparation leading up to debate day. Why can you do this? Because there are essentially more of you in the classroom than there are students. Do you have 30 students in your class? Do you have 40 or more? With this recorded method, if you are a one-to-one school, there'll be one more of you every time. This makes it easier to monitor. This just happens to lower incredibly the amount of interruptions that lead to behavioral referrals, and it leads to students discovering an identity truly as learners, as readers, as analyzers, as problem solvers, as experimenters, because you're giving them that chance to wall out and tune in. Okay, let's look at some specific steps you need to think about when you are preparing this world for students to enter the next day or the next week.
See here in this graphic, and this is one of the most important graphics in this training, that in the focus and flow method, we can learn to control several design factors in those worlds unto themselves that we create in advance of class day. And these factors are changeable aspects of the recorded interactive lessons for students we can create. Let's just go through them and then talk about each one in a little bit more detail. We need to consider the length of the recorded lesson that we create. We need to be aware of its volume and its clarity. And clarity here, I refer to two things. I refer to its conceptual clarity, but also to the simple practical sensory clarity of the recording. We need to look at how well we have edited the file we've created, and according to several criteria. We need especially to consider the tone of voice that we have used to create the recording. Are we imbuing the recording with a sense of enthusiasm and focus, or are we letting ourselves go flat? And the tone here is essentially the energy of the recording, and we need to attend to it carefully. We also need to think about what kind of grouping strategy might you use for this class that you're going to lead, using your replicated selves to help you carry it off. Okay. We need to also look at what activities you have integrated into the recorded experience. This is essential. We need to look also at the materials that you are using along with the recording, which is what really makes it effective. And then we need to look at the complexity of the lesson or lessons that we will offer to students in this world unto itself. Okay, so when we learn the focus and flow method, we learn to adjust each of these factors to reach our intended audience, or intended audiences plural, most effectively. And if we're practicing the focus and flow method as communities, then we need to discuss our standards to support the creation of team lesson sharing, so that if I'm using a lesson from a teacher who works on an opposite hall in the building, then we know what our standards are, and we can be confident offering one another's work with our group of students. Okay, so let's look at length first. Here on the left side of this screen that you can see here, do we create a recording that takes the full class, 4/5 of class, half, 1/5 only? This matters quite a lot. Because, of course, it means that you're going to do more work in advance to create a high-quality full class recording, especially if your class is a block class that goes 90 minutes. This is some pretty considerable work on your part. But then it means, of course, that your students will be immersed in the recorded world for most or all of your time together. You might prefer this, but be conscious of it. And if you want to save time for discussion with small groups that follow individual work in the recording, or even as small groups and then a whole class at the end, think about how to time the recorded work, which doesn't just include the length of your recording, but the length of time that different students will need to move through it, and to move through the initial individual question sets and creative activities that you do before going to the group activity. Now, here's the advantage of designing a class in a tiered way like that, where you start off with individuals immersing themselves in the world you've created and forming their own comprehension and getting their own work finished. Well, here's the first advantage. When you move those students then into small group activity from there, those students will be in conversation with one another, having brought a lot of work and material to the table. Right from the beginning in that conversation, small group activity becomes much more productive in this context. Well, then, your small groups, having functioned much more effectively, are much more prepared to confidently enter a whole group conversation. This is actually my favorite way to design the recorded lesson, because we get a bit of everything. We get a deep plunge into individual conversation and learning that the students can control themselves. I love that for them, the independence of it, the safety of it, the immersion in the world of imagination. But then from that, then connecting with peers and being effective in that connection. I think this raises students' esteem when they see themselves being able to draw upon what they've done to contribute. And then when the groups join, and the groups join in this rich way in a conversation that can flow and work, well, it's exciting. It's that feeling of group flow where a whole group of people, they lose themselves in the process of connecting around sharing ideas. This becomes possible with this format. Now, if you have classes that simply cannot conduct a whole class conversation, then I would recommend using longer recorded formats and then selectively pulling off small groups for live face-to-face instruction and interaction with you and with one another. In this way, you can hold the classroom under control and focus in a mesmerizing way with the recording, and then you can selectively pull students off to get that live face-to-face interaction that we want to preserve and that we want to improve in our classrooms. Okay, so this length of file issue is one of the most important ones. That's why we've put it first. Let's look at some simpler ones now. Volume. You just need to go back and you need to check this factor of your work, volume, because you want the physical experience of this interaction, which is going to be primarily built around the sound of the voice. It needs to be pleasant and comfortable for students. What we want here is something between audible and loud. We want that clear range. Of course, students can adjust this when they adjust the volume on their headphones or computer, but sometimes the recording itself limits what students can do in this regard. And so make sure that you have set the initial volume of your recording at one that is pleasing. And this makes a big unconscious difference. And it will either help to draw the students into the world you've created, or it could repel them from it. So while this is a simpler factor, it's one that has a very large effect on how your students receive what you've done creatively. So make sure that the volume's perfect. Okay? Clarity. Let's look at clarity. You want to make sure that your lesson progresses. Let's talk about logical clarity first. That it progresses in such a way where students can build from accessible ideas and then begin to reach toward more complicated tasks and questions. So you'll be able to gauge this with each group by looking at outcomes. Something that I almost always do with my recorded lessons is have students complete an activity that we can grade together or that is automatically graded, such as in Canvas-based quizzes or any kind of learning management system-based quizzes that can auto-grade. And this way you are getting a constant flow of results that helps you to tune the logical clarity of the lesson you've designed. And this is one of the things I also love about this method is the amount and the richness and the quickness and the ease with which you get grades to put into the system and data to help you adjust your approach. It's excellent for all of these purposes. Now let's talk about clarity just in terms of the sensory experience. And this is again comparable to volume. You want to make sure that students don't have to strain to hear what you're saying. You want to be able to enunciate clearly for them so that they can just get right into the content. This is like looking through a window. We want the window to be perfectly clear so that we look out at the beautiful things that are out in the landscape right next to the building where we are learning. If the window itself is splotchy, then we're experiencing the splotches. So please attend to the sensory clarity as well of your recording. Okay, the fourth is tone. And tone's so important. Tone is the energy, the emotional energy that we are sharing with our students. And that's going to affect their tone as they go about creating their work. And it's going to, of course, set the mood for the lesson. So I think there are essentially 5 tone categories I'd encourage you to think about. And let's start at the top. We have positive tone that is also very high energy. This is extreme enthusiasm. This is joyousness that's through the roof. And sometimes we might have that. But I think what we mostly want is a positive tone that is just mellow and clear and stable and sets a kind of warm atmosphere for the learning environment. And this is the tone that I coached myself to create in my lessons. Now, that's going to change if I'm reading a story that calls for me to create a brooding tone or a haunted tone. Then, of course, I'll bring that into the reading to an extent. But that's different. The students will understand that that is a tone that is proper to the text and not one that is coming from my individual mood. Okay, a neutral or a moderate tone is also probably most proper for some topics, especially if you're aiming to show that you yourself are neutral or trying to encourage open-mindedness about a topic. So consider situations in which a neutral or moderate tone might be most effective. Now, the negative tones, which can again be kind of low energy or highly charged, I think we only want to use these negative tones when we are modeling the content of a story or a poem, for example. Or if we're looking at a nonfiction work about an aspect of war. In this case, of course, we would expect negative tones. But those negative tones are in quote marks. They are controlled, and the students would know that. Okay, but here's maybe perhaps the biggest issue of tone for you to watch for. Make sure that your tone is engaging, right? Make sure that the voice you're using is one that students would actually want to hear and that gives them that sense of a spark of your own recognition of the beauty and importance of what you're doing. When we talk about perma and we talk about meaning, well, students are going to get the sense that what we're doing has meaning if they hear a sense of your voice, they hear a tone in your voice that shows that you're after something here. And they're going to follow the direction of your tone. So this is one of the most powerful tools you have at your disposal. And while you've got the attention of your students, make sure that you then win their loyalty, their following even more strongly by how you use your tone. Okay, let's look at the fifth bar here right in the middle, editing. You can meticulously edit files so that they are beautiful. I think that my best recordings included excerpts of other recordings, music, interviews, other sound effects, occasionally an image, a photograph that I'd created, that I think were just high quality productions. Of course, this is more time intensive, but once you have done it, the effort stands for months and years to come, and it's a beautiful thing. So you won't always have time to meticulously create your product and to edit it in such a way. But set the goal to make each recording meet the next standard, and that is that your recording is clean and clear and help students get excellent immersion and in the content and contact with the meaning that you hope that they will find in that work. It might even be passable that your recording is decent, but I think it's important that you notice the distinction between decent work and work that's clean and clear. And certainly, and this is something that your colleagues and yourself can help one another to discover, if your editing is inconsistent or even neglectful, you're going to want this to come to your attention, because this is the way that you ensure that the world unto itself that you're creating for the classroom is actually one that's captivating. So make sure to really invest in editing and open yourself to feedback. Now, a great thing about this method is that when you're posting the recordings, it means that your teaching colleagues and your administrative colleagues can look at it and listen to it as well. This is a great thing because you can fill the content with clear pursuit of standards, depth of content, and you can make that evident every single day. Your principal can see that you're doing great work. And I think that feels reassuring to you, to the teacher. Now, it also means that you're going to be able to receive more feedback. This too is great. If you can lean into that, it means that your work is going to get better and better because you have the input of other experts. All right, let's look at grouping. This is so important. You can use the recording and keep students immersed in it for the whole class, or for 4/5 of the class, or 3/5 of the class, or half. We've talked about this when we talked about the length of the file. But this is another way of looking at that same thing. If you group the students such that you're pulling, say, 5 of them off at a time to come up with you to hold a conversation or maybe even a full class length debate, well, then you can hold the rest of the class in the spell of attention and productive activity while you do that. And you can speak out loud as loudly as I'm speaking now, and the rest of the students won't be disturbed by that. They'll be able to read and focus deeply. And this is an advantage you've got. Your small group work will be so much more effective because the room will be quieter for your group, and the rest of the group will go on with their learning in a completely different plan even. And it can all happen and get to great depth and success because of the structure of attention and the way that you've built it in your method. Okay, now let's look at the very bottom of the grouping. You could put 0 people on the recording, and this is another advantage of this method, is that you don't have to use it with every class. Let's say that you've got a class that's extremely high functioning, and then 3 or 4 of your other classes are very chaotic. Well, All right, if your students are able and to do on their own without any need for the recording a better job, or at least as good a job, then you have the option of not using it. And this is what I like, is that when you have this method prepared, your range of options is rather extraordinary. You can go a conventional route if you think it can work. But if your conventional route can't work, you have so many options at your disposal. And the same is not true if you only prepare for a conventional kind of classroom conversation. If you only prepare for conversation to work without this method, you do not have the recordings method and all of the things it makes possible at your disposal. I know which situation I have come to prefer through years of experience, and I encourage you to build this. Let's look at activity. With this method, you can pursue multi-step, multi-day, and multi-skill activities confidently because you are building these steps and timing them predictably every day in the recordings that you learn to control through your length and grouping strategies. Or you might go for a multi-step, multi-day, but single skill activity. Let's say that you're getting prepared to take those end of grade tests and you want to focus more on multiple choice testing. So you could create multiple choice tests in response to a novella or a series of essays or a series of poems. But your skill is going to focus on analyzing questions. Okay. But in the multi-skill section above, you could do multiple choice questions, and you could also do writings, and you could do artwork, and you can get students focusing on these things again because they are immersed in that world. And then you can go on down the scale here to two-step single-day multi-skill activities, or two-step single-day single-skill activities, or even the simplest of things. You've got one step in the activity you're designing. It's going to last a single day, and it's going to exercise a single skill. And there are advantages in all of these formats. The key is your method helps you be able to hold all of these formats in a very stable and predictable timeline. All right, materials. Another important consideration. You can choose to maximize students' immersion in digital technology, not just your audio recording. Some of you might want to use a video aspect if you are modeling how to complete equations or draw geometrical figures or do artwork. Art teachers could benefit from this method in that they can immerse their students in a one-to-one modeling session where the student is getting video of how to model a technique, and the teacher's instruction comes through the headphones without any distraction around in the classroom leaking in. And this is something that art students who are really committed to art greatly appreciate. Okay, so in this case, the teacher would still use art materials, of course, physical art materials, but everything else would be digital, visual and audio. Now, let's go down to the next step. You still have high digital immersion with some minimal physical materials. So this might mean you've made an audio recording and you've made a learning system-based test, like a Canvas-based quiz or test, for example, but you have one small written aspect that the students are going to work on, or you have a paper book that students are also reading. All right, let's go down to the next level. You could have an even blend of digital and physical materials. And think about what you're going to do in this lesson and why you're doing it. Why are you using the physical materials instead of the digital? Well, if you're conducting a science experiment, you want to get students hands-on experience, they're going to need that physical material in order to get it. But your digital instructions, possibly with some visual modeling, will help them to do that with accuracy and continuous concentration. All right, or you could go down to the very bottom here and look at a lesson that consists mainly working with physical materials, paper books and handwritten assignments, and only an audio recording, for example. This is actually the format that I used most frequently, and I absolutely loved working this way. It was very effective with students, and it relied heavily on their imagination. We did a lot of coaching on imagination and how to initiate it within oneself. And I found it to be one of the most effective ways to get students to explore an inner world and discover its joys. All right, last of all, let's be aware, and this is typical of any lesson we create, we want to be aware of the level of complexity. Is our lesson very simple? Does it need to be? All right, make it so, but be aware of that. Is it entry level? Is it moderate, challenging, or very complex? Know your levels and know why you've set them that way. A quick note on the very complex setting here in terms of levels of complexity. You can use this method with high functioning classes to do something that is otherwise quite difficult to accomplish, even with a very high functioning talented group. And I've done this. So, for example, if you want your students to read 2 novels at the same time, or to read 1 long novel and then to read a memoir or another type of nonfiction at the same time, the way that I've done this is I've divided the class in half, where I have 10 to 15 students sitting around a long oval table with me at the center, where we read aloud together and we stop and we have conversation and we do writings throughout the entire period. At the same time, the other half of the students are seated in a large ring that surrounds that oval, and they are immersed in a completely different book, but they are navigating it independently. And they can use a recording to wall out distraction and also coach them on both endurance and, yes, the basics of decoding and prompts to comprehension. Because even our high functioning students meet a challenge point where they would give up if they didn't have that extra support. And so think about using this for pushing your students to higher order thinking as well. Since you've got their attention in a world unto itself, you can explore how far you can push this with your audiences, and you know them, and you can keep on tuning the lessons to your different audience's needs through your editing technique. And thank you for the time and energy you put into that. It's a very important part of learning this method, and I wanted to make sure to share with you all of those details. Let's look now at a related conversation. What are the teacher activities? What are the things a teacher needs to do in order to get ready to create the lesson and then to deliver it? All right, let's go through. The teacher needs to, of course, assemble the materials for the recorded interactive lesson at least the day before, right? And prepare a quiet space for lesson creation. This latter part can be quite hard. What if you don't really have a quiet space in your home? Well, is there a place in a library or a cafe nearby or outside? This is essential, however, because remember, we want the lesson that you're creating to be the focus of what your students are going to be hearing and seeing. All right. Now here, the second point is something that can really help you solidify your communication with your colleagues and your administrators, your teaching colleagues and administrators. Determine and state, or at least write, the standards that you're going to be teaching to show administrators the content you'll address in the lesson. And writing these standards in the lesson introduction is important. You might consider even stating them in the recording too, at the start or at the end. Usually I would just write them and that was enough. Primarily this kind of communication I think is for administrators, but students might be interested in it as well. Make the judgment call there. Third, we talked about choosing the length of time for the recorded part of the lesson. Remember to allow time for students to pause, rewind, work on activities, complete assessments, and optionally to work with peers to conclude class. Now, to help you anticipate, let's look at the first note there. If you plan to create a 30-minute recording, allow yourself double that time. It might not take you double, but the planning is only one part. The creation is only one part. Then there's also the process of posting and editing before posting. So essentially allow yourself, again, double the time of the ultimate length of the recording you're going to create. Now, let's note something very important. I put a star next to it and I highlighted here. The time that you give to the recording session, this is where it happens. And this is what spares you the burden of repetition, interruption, and stress. Think back to all of those 12 major stresses that we addressed in the beginning of this module. Here is where you conquer those stresses. Here's where you address everything. You make classroom transformation possible. Now, if you and your colleagues are doing this together, you all create good recordings that meet your shared standards, then you will save one another a considerable amount of time and energy while serving your students more effectively. Now, the key here to making that work is that each colleague attends to quality and that you do have shared standards upon which you've agreed. But this is where it works. So if you want to make focus and flow work, you get yourself into a creative flow in this session and you make your work shine. And then you go into the next day and you've already said it. You've said it once. And the rest of your energy can go to creative uses, either that you've planned or that you improvise. Okay, fourth, before and during lesson creation, I've talked about this, I'll say it again, it's worth it. Summon warm and positive energy for the recording. You want to set the tone for connection with your group. Now, while you're doing this, keep tabs on the design factors that we talked about as you create and edit. And that's in order to meet high standards for content and delivery. All right, next, and this is quite important here. You've created the recording. Well, you have to have some place to put it where the students can find it easily. Post the lesson to the website that you've created yourself or to the learning system that your school has used where students will be able to access it. Test the links, go through it as a student would go through it, and make sure the lesson is set, and then you're ready to go. Now, this is very important for how to conduct yourself in the class. We talked about the importance of tone within your recording. Well, tone is very important in how you conduct this method once you get into the class, especially the first few times you try it. A quick story is worth our time here. The first day I tried this, I knew what I wanted to do and what I thought was possible. It was huge for me. It meant so much for me that this could be successful. I did not want my students to know I felt and thought that at all. I wanted to just walk in like it was a normal day and say, okay, we're gonna do this. You want to keep that low-key tone with your students, especially for their first few times. You don't want to let students know that you're trying something that they could then decide to target. Just give warm welcome, frame the day positively, flow with it, and let it go from there. This is very important to do. All right. Now, again, while you're in class, you want to clearly post the access site for students to self-organize. Eventually, they'll walk in, they'll look at that place that they need to go in their learning system or on the web, and they'll connect with the lesson, and they'll start doing this on their own within minutes. And this enables you to monitor their engagement, and you can also position their screens for easy viewing so that wherever you are in the classroom, you're able to see if they're on task. You could also use a monitoring system like Land School to help you do that. Now, again, to maintain freshness and variety, especially if you're using this method in multiple classrooms in your school, you teachers want to make sure to utilize different lesson lengths, grouping strategies, and materials, and this will keep the method fresh. Very important, especially since you want to use this over the long haul. Now, after class, this is for you. Reflect on PERMA V in each class. Did you get positive emotion and engagement? Did you get positive relationship building? For students, that's relationships to ideas, relationships to self, to peers, to you, and other things. Did you find that the students found meaning in what they did today? Did you find meaning in your interaction with them in the classroom? Did you create for them a chance to learn, for example? Accomplishment. Did students start to show growth? Did they get a 100% on the test or quiz for the first time? Did they accomplish more work and pay attention for longer? All of these are accomplishments to celebrate. Vitality. Did it feel healthier in your classroom for you and the students? Was there less conflict? Was there more positivity? Go through that and think about PERMA V. It's what we want to grow together. Check the academic outcomes. Look through the quizzes. Did people finish? What kinds of scores did they earn? And then adjust your design factors accordingly. Now, for the long term, you want to get ahead in lesson creation where you can, and you want to invite administrative and teacher input, and work with your PLCs to edit and improve in any or all of the design factors. And ideally, you want to share work and tune your classroom application strategies, and this helps the method to work at a very high level. Okay, now we are in the real grit of this training here, and so it's important that we get some more details. And this is the longest and most challenging aspect of this module is just all the new concepts that I need to introduce in some detail. And I hope that you feel free to pause this and take breaks as you need. let's look at a checklist of necessary and desirable materials and conditions. And again, these are factors that you, the interactive lesson creator, you need to consider and control. And there are three categories that I put here. One concerning computers and supporting technology, another concerning physical materials, and then another concerning community. Let's look at them. The teacher first. You need a take-home computer and an at-work computer, or maybe you have one for both, for creating and, if necessary, playing interactive lessons. This is foundational. Now, also, sticking with the teacher, you need a reliable computer-compatible microphone, and if desired, a camera, for making high-quality recordings. And this is possibly a personal expense. I went out and bought my own microphone because I wanted to get to work immediately on this, but this is something that your school might supply for you. Look into that. Now, the recording programs that you use, these are free for download online. Audacity and GarageBand are wonderful recording programs that enable you to do all kinds of sophisticated editing that will go well beyond what you not only will need, but maybe even what you'll want. And you can find them, I'll say in a moment here, online. A little bit more on that in a moment. You can also do recording on your learning system, such as Canvas. And Canvas isn't quite as good because you can't pause it. You have to get everything in one take and you can't edit it afterward. But it's still a very powerful tool, and I've had a very good experience using Canvas as my primary recording system. Now, also sticking with you here, teacher, you need a free MP3 or audio file converter. And that works with your free Audacity or free GarageBand recording program. So the challenge for you here is that you need to use a search engine to find the free downloads, either for your Mac or for your PC, and then to find the associated MP3 converter programs to go with the one you've selected. And that's, again, unless you're using Canvas's built-in recording system, which is also great. So free guides for how to use Audacity and GarageBand are also available online. There is not a lot of self-education to do here, and what I would recommend that you do is work with your technology coordinator and or work with your peers at school to help each other through this, because there are a lot of factors that go beyond what we can discuss in this module, such as, for example, if your school has given you an excellent work computer, but the administrative settings are controlled by someone else, you might need the administrator of your computer to allow you to download Audacity or GarageBand. And that might be a step that you need to take. It's a small step, and it shouldn't slow you down, but maybe a day. But you'll want to get through it in that way. Don't let it stop you. This is where the technology aspect of this could discourage you. Persist. The results are worth it. Think about all of the pressures you're facing that we talked about again in the beginning of this. This is a small pressure compared to those bigger ones that you're dealing with. Okay, let's look at the fifth thing that teachers need to consider here. Get a YouTube account or a media internet account or website, something that allows you to post your recordings. I used a Weebly account that I created myself and loved the experience. And I've also used Canvas. So there are lots of ways here you can post content, and you're going to want to do this just according to your own knowledge and preference, or perhaps what it is that your technology coordinator or your fellow teachers can help you to do. Or maybe you're a tech-savvy teacher yourself and you know exactly what you want. All right, last, you need that quiet place, preferably at home or in a convenient, accessible location for making your recordings. All right, now there are two student needs here concerning computers and supporting tech. Students need access to computers and internet in class or the laboratory. A 1-to-1 ratio is strongly preferable, but it's not required. There was one year where my school had fewer computers available, and I could only give 10 computers out maximum at one time in groups as large as nearly 30. But that's fine. What I did was I used a grouping strategy, and for one part of the class, I had students rotate in while the other two groups were doing something either with me directly or independently. And while that wasn't as effective a way of implementing focus and flow, it helped enormously. So even if you don't have a 1-to-1 ratio, this is still something that you can use to get real gains that make a difference in all of the pressure areas we've talked about. Even if you just have one computer, yours, to play over a smartboard, even that can help you get more control of an especially chaotic class. So while that's not ideal, it's still better than going it alone. Another simple thing students need is access to headphones or earbuds to use during the recorded interactive portion of class. Most of them already own some. Okay, physical materials. I strongly recommend paper books or printed reading sets, class sets whenever possible. Use digital readers, of course, if they're necessary or desired, but the reason here is that, again, paper books do not have any distractions built into them. Students' attention will focus much more purely. Neuroscience research shows that the eye flows differently on a physical printed page in comparison to how the eye moves on a computer screen. Typically, the computer screen is much harsher. It poses an endurance challenge for students. Eye strain becomes an issue much more quickly, but also the eye tends to skip around on a computer screen, whereas it tends to flow on a page. Now, magnify that skipping or that flowing activity over the period of an entire academic year. That translates either to flowing attention or skipping around attention. Over a year, that makes a very big difference. Please do go with paper books or printed materials if at all possible. Now, the next thing that you need is interactive activities that are printed, or you could go digital or hybrid. Now note, Canvas quizzes auto-grade and allow multiple attempts, and I used this reliably and students loved it. It helped me win their commitment to the process. But I also had students use printed books and do written printed work because this simplified the sensory experience of the technological aspect of the lesson. It was just a voice. And then the rest of it enabled them to use their bodies, to hold the book with their hands, to write or draw with a pencil or a pen or an art material. And this really helped with engagement and the feeling of health in what we were doing. Okay, and then you need the simplest things: pencils, art materials, science lab materials, and math problem sets. The usual things, but you'll be able to use them much more deeply and effectively because students are paying attention so consistently. Now, community, what do you need? You need to work with your technology coordinator and your media center coordinator who could perhaps help you buy the book sets at your school. This connection can be very helpful to you. Your teaching colleagues in your PLC, if you're using this method together, this can be extremely helpful. You need your principal and APs, and your restorative practices coordinator or coordinators, and counselor or counselors to understand at least what you're doing and to support you in doing it. And if you're doing it together with colleagues, this can maximize the school-wide effectiveness of focus and flow. All right, now that's enough. If you can all do that on your own, then you don't need any additional support based on what you learn to do from watching this module. This is an option. You could arrange a one-to-one, a PLC, or a school-wide strategy and consulting session with me, and we could look at how you can tune all of the ideas in this module to your specific classes and overall school setting and culture. And I would love to do so. But I hope earnestly that you're able to master this method and implement it on your own with a very satisfying effectiveness without needing anything more from me. Let's look now at this short video description. I want to engage you as personally as I can in this module to talk about a comparison that I think is quite helpful for understanding why it is that this focus and flow method is so effective at getting students to pay attention and then within that field of attention to achieve growth. In order to get a deeper understanding of how it is that this method works, let's make a couple of comparisons to different activities in different environments and look at how they compare to what we do in a classroom with focus and flow. So first, let's consider a movie theater or a theater on Broadway where people have come to see a show. And for ourselves, let's not watch the show with them, let's watch the audience. What do we see? They're just sitting there.
They're not making all that much noise. Occasionally, if they laugh or cry out, that's something that the creative team had intended from the audience. And so it's not a disruption, it's part of the experience. But if we're just watching that group, we're looking at people who are sitting still for 2, maybe 3 hours, and we're wondering, well, how could this be meaningful? Well, it's meaningful because the action is internal, right? All the change, all the meaning is experienced within. Let's take a second example. Let's walk together into a university or a public library, and once again, let's observe the audience. What are they doing? Quite often, they are seated, immersed in quiet activity, stretching for hours. Now and then they get up to get a drink of water, to go and find a book, to stretch a little bit. But it looks like really they aren't doing much. Certainly they aren't giving many outward signs of what they're doing. But like the theater goers, they are having an experience that is transformational. The action is psychological, it is emotional. In some way, it's even physical. So now let's turn to the classroom and consider a particular event that happens at the end of each year, the end of year exams, for which students sit for about 2 to 3 hours. This looks a lot like what was happening in the movie theater, in the Broadway play theater, in the library. People sitting and immersed in deep states of concentration. What are those students doing in this classroom taking those end of grade exams? The action is psychological. Now, why does this comparison matter so much? Because in the focus and flow method, day on day and week after week, month after month, teachers can immerse students in a similar kind of activity where externally, there's calm, there's quiet. Internally, there is a world of change. There is a world of activity, a flow of imagination, which is action. And it's exactly the kind of action that we need to produce in classrooms if we hope to move students more deeply into a love of learning, into an appreciation for content, and into a place where they can acquire knowledge and skills to propel them forward into the lives they choose for themselves. The action is psychological. This method helps students to learn that kind of action and learn to love it.
The only way to help students experience this kind of deep immersion in content that gets them identifying as students is to have the teacher replicate a performance that invites the students into an interaction. So again, I want to come back to this graphic and have you imagine for a moment what it would be like to work with a dozen or more, 30 or more, 40 or more replicas of yourself in a positive tone as a leader through an interactive activity, but that students can control on their own. How might that change your classroom every day? What might it enable you to do in terms of communicating more of yourself, more of your knowledge, more of your personality that can come out because you don't constantly get pulled into unpleasant discipline-based conversations? This is one of the main advantages, one of the main benefits that comes to you, the teacher, and to the students from this program. But let's look at how it is that you could explain the advantages of this program to others. I think this is something that you might find yourself wanting to do, or maybe even finding yourself having to do. And there are 3 kinds of advantages we should consider here. Advantages for students and families, advantages for teachers, and advantages for principals. Let's actually start at the bottom there and look at advantages for principals. The program provides an effective and equitable in-house behavior management solution for teachers, which lowers referrals and thus takes a lot of pressure off of principals. It's flowing down to them from the superintendent's office. This is a very big advantage for principals. Simultaneously, the program raises students' growth potential in both academics and social emotional wellness. And these are primary purposes for a principal leading a mission in a school: academic and social and emotional growth. And the program can also facilitate communication and simplify logistics for teachers and restorative practices counselors in handling matters related to academics and discipline both. So principals gain so many very significant advantages by having teachers use this program. Let's look at advantages for students and families. The program creates a daily, consistent culture of attention that supports significant academic and personal growth. Families can feel better about sending their kids into a school where teachers use this method to prevent classroom chaos from denying them opportunity. And that leads to the second one here. The program sharply reduces or eliminates classroom chaos and replaces it with order and focus. And that's without you getting into conflicts with people. You can handle things so much more calmly. And this is because the program helps distraction-prone students to stay focused on their work, earn success, and stay in school. Well, let's go to the fourth one. Preventing distracting students from denying opportunity to students who are willing to engage and learn. Without struggle, you take care of all this. And that really helps the families and the students. And then the program makes excellent learning materials available to students, families, tutors, and counselors on a 24/7 basis. These are excellent advantages for students and families. Now, we've already gotten into some of the advantages for teachers, but let's go over them again. The program promotes and protects orderly and efficient learning without you having to lean into disciplinarian tactics. What a huge relief. What multiple reliefs this is. The program allows teachers' best selves, their best knowledge, personality, and care to show through clearly all the time. The program greatly reduces or eliminates the exhaustion of repetitiveness, making each one of your classes a creative experience. The program helps a teacher to serve a principal effectively by simultaneously reducing referrals and raising growth, and this can really help your relationship to your principal. The program saves labor, energy, and time while helping teachers to accomplish more and better work. This alone makes it worth it to use this program. You put your work into making the recording. That's where a lot of the labor happens. Then when you get into class, things are just so much easier, they're so much more fun, and so much more productive and effective. The program enables teachers also to conduct multiple, even complex activities at the same time without those activities and groups distracting from one another. This is an amazing quality of the focus and flow technique. The program also supports higher order thinking by creating support for concentration, challenging reading, and multi-step lessons, units, and projects that require steady and consistent attention and which build mental endurance. And then last listed here, but this is not all the advantages, but last listed here is the program enhances communication with colleagues and it makes frequent detailed review easy for administrators. So many advantages that we can win here by using this program well. And it helps us to get the classroom we work to create, where every student desk is a world unto itself and a center of activity, where alone and together we create the aspects of PERMA. Day on day and week on week and month after month through the year. Now, as we prepare to start talking about classroom grouping strategies that you can use, let's also tackle head-on the possible problems you might face in implementing this method. And we'll also look at some solutions that match to those possible problems. Wanted to do some troubleshooting ahead of time in case you run into any difficulty. And again, let's start at the bottom here. Students at lower levels work very slowly sometimes. But let's say that while they're working very slowly, within the method, they're remaining engaged the whole time. But even so, they don't finish, and even they fail their work. Here is the solution I recommend to that. Consistently reward their study engagement. These students are not yet D proficient. They're not yet even earning Ds. But they are working constantly and remaining consistently engaged. They are on the path. They are growing. Let me give you a stunning example from my own experience. I worked with an ELL student, a young man who showed a lot of ability in math, but who had scored the lowest EOG English score in the entire grade. Okay. He focused so hard on our readings every single day. He stayed immersed in this process so consistently, and he earned low D's and F's on a lot of our quizzes, especially for about the first month, month and a half. But then something remarkable began to happen. He started to get the occasional C or high B, still earned some D's and F's, but was consistently engaged. And he enjoyed what he was doing as well. And I continued to go ahead and give him that D because his work was so steady and, in terms of volume, so significant for him. And he paid consistent attention and invested in the process. When he took the EOG, his test score went up from the previous year by 19 scale score points. A movement of 3 to 5 scale score points is considered quite significant. He went up 19 scale score points and made the biggest improvement in the entire grade. He learned in one of the most distracting classes I've ever taught in 22 years. This method made it possible for him to focus the whole time and get extraordinary growth and feel so proud of his accomplishment. Let's look at the problem right above that one. A student's computer breaks or goes missing. Well, this is where you can invite that student up to the front of the room for some teacher-guided work. You can work one-on-one or in a small group. Say this happens with a few students. Great. Okay, well, the rest of your room's quiet, and you can have those students focus with you. Now, if you're leading a short lesson as far as the digital recording, you can have the student or students whose computer or computers aren't working or are missing to then borrow the computer of a friend while you then rotate students to the in-person learning with you, while the students missing the computer go on and work with the technology provided by a classmate. I've used this solution before and it's never thrown things off. Okay, let's go to the next one up. The problem is that a student or a small group of students try to prevent the lesson from starting or proceeding at all. And it's been extremely rare in the years I've used this method for this to be a problem. But in the cases where it looked like it would come up, I just calmly reassured all the students to continue, to feel free to raise their headset volume if they wished. And then I simply ignored or stalled or waited out or invited the resistant students into live instruction with me. And I simply never let my tone escalate, never got into a contest of wills, and the large majority of my students were on into the recorded world and didn't even hear anything happening. So this just simply hasn't been a problem. If it does come up, this is the way to do it. You have a structure in place. The students who want to use a recording, nothing can stop them. And your problem is therefore greatly minimized, and you can relax going forward in whatever you need to do. You may need to call for behavioral intervention, but you'll need to do it with a smaller group, and you can do it while everything is still going, progress is moving forward. Let's look at the next one up here. This is also in the middle. Let's say that your colleagues don't step up and they're not reliable in creating interactive lesson recordings that meet your standard. The solution I suggest here is to work with strong colleagues around the district or even the state. You could also ask your technology coordinator to work with you to design an in-house professional development session where your colleagues get that help they need, but without necessarily having to take instruction from you. These are two ways I would suggest handling this, but I would note that doing your own work on the recordings method is still completely worthwhile because your classroom is going to get all of the same benefits in helping you address the pressures we've discussed here in this module. All right, let's look at the one that's just right below the top one. The problem, your principal does not understand why you're using this method and pressures you to explain. Well, there are a few solutions here. One is you can refer to several of the slides in this module and ask the principal to consider it, the information. You could also have your principal read the free information about Focus and Flow at synergycreativelearning.education website. There's also a Focus and Flow module for principals or for administrators, and I would recommend that the principal consider watching that module for professional development and consider applying Focus and Flow throughout the school. So there are lots of good options here. All right, the problem that's listed there at the top of the page. You have a student or a small group of students who feel inclined to sleep instead of engaging in the activity. Since this activity does tend to be so calming, there's some students who might ordinarily look for stimulation by disrupting and talking out of turn and getting up out of the seats and so forth. There are a couple solutions here that work. One is you can seat that individual student or group of students near by yourself for live instruction, face to face. Or sometimes simply moving the students near to you makes the students more aware that you're watching, and so they're going to make an effort to remain engaged. But both of these are very good solutions that I've used in this situation, and it solves the problem very quickly. Okay, so before we go to talk about class formats that you can use to make the focus and flow method work consistently and with fresh variety, let's look at this graphic, and this is one of my favorite ones, even though perhaps it's quite simple, to represent what it looks like to work in a focus and flow classroom and school compared to the conventional approach of each individual professional going into a classroom and making a stand on one's own. So this graphic presents a contrast of the readiness and the resources available to principals and teachers and restorative practice coordinators in two different disruption-prone schools. Let's look at the one on the right where the school does not have the advantage of the focus and flow method. Every teacher goes into a classroom alone and wages a battle to try and elicit attention and manage all of the competing pressures that you, the teacher, listening to this module, know about in a very personal way, and do so much work to try and resolve, and yet with so little resources and help at your disposal. And the restorative practices coordinator does this same thing, working on an unpredictable schedule to try and settle some of the highest needs and most disruption-prone students in the school to settle and re-engage. This is very difficult, and the conventional approach is not serving our schools, our districts, our states, or our country effectively. This is a major problem that our country needs to address urgently, but without resorting to major discipline. And how can we do that? Well, let's consider the advantages of a school that is using focus and flow in every vulnerable classroom, at least. If not in every classroom, then in every vulnerable classroom. Well, these teachers have then an enormous resource that wins attention and provides structure while reducing the amount of energy and effort required to do so, while getting much more effective results. It's just incredible. The difference of teaching in a chaotic classroom before and after using this method is so profound. I don't know if I could fully express it in words. I hope you get the experience. If you are working in a chaotic classroom, I hope you get the experience of seeing how different, how much better it can be in every regard. Now, the restorative practices coordinator too, and I have a module for restorative practices coordinators. These are formally called in-school suspension officers. They too can welcome students at any time of the day, because their schedules are not as regular, with a prepared curriculum aimed at helping students to settle, reflect, understand themselves, and at the same time build their literacy and listening skills and endurance skills. This is a wonderful resource for restorative practices coordinators. Also, if restorative practices coordinators need work from teachers to help those students make progress in their classes while the students are suspended but in school in a restorative practices context, well, the teacher has excellent recorded material that the restorative practice coordinator can bring up right there very easily. The logistics of this and the communication around this are greatly simplified. All right, so with that, let's now look at how it is that we can use different classroom and lesson formats to help students get the advantages of focus and flow. And here on the first slide, we can see that we've moved forward with the idea that every desk can be a classroom center of self-regulated student creative activity in the interactive lesson. But the teacher has decided that this is going to coincide with focus on in-person instruction for very small groups. And the teacher can form these groups for any purpose, level of ability, whether it be very high or very low, Work on a specific challenge, such as helping students learn how to form richer paragraphs that include citations of data. That conversation can go on with a normal volume, even with a rather high volume, while the other 25 students pictured here can go on with the plan that the teacher has created, moving themselves toward completion of their goals. And this is one example that makes, I think, a little bit more concrete the idea that a teacher can hold groups extremely stable within this format. Now, here you have 6 groups of 5. If your recording is of a certain length, then you can simply have students do the in-person and the recording both during the same class period. Or even 2 or 3 of these groups of 5 could meet with you personally while the other 3 go on a longer recording. And then on the next day, you switch. The groups that met with you and did shorter recorded lessons the previous day can then go through and do the longer lesson on the second day. And the students who've completed that longer lesson can then switch. So they can complete a shorter lesson while getting the chance to work with you individually. This is just one of many flexible formats you can use. All right, let's go to another one. And this is one that I used quite frequently. Students can hold 3 in-depth activities, actually more, at the same time without pulling one another out of focus. Now, for example, you could have a group of 10 reading a short story on one recorded set, and then another group of 10 could read a work of nonfiction like a memoir, and then a third group could hold a 5 versus 5 live in-person debate with the teacher moderating, and this could go on for the entire period. And the groups could rotate among these activities over a period of 3 days. And again, on each day, without any distraction between the groups and with minimal teacher management. In this instance, you can achieve 3 complex goals and lead 3 complex activities at the same time and get an enormous amount of work done and predict accurately the amount of time it will take you to accomplish these goals with your classes with much less energy and required for management and instruction, because you have done such excellent preparation in advance and you've made yourself this digital centaur with, of course, your human energy steering the whole and orchestrating the whole series of events in the classroom. And this is such a marvelous difference from a classroom that is constantly broken by distraction. Here's yet another example. Let's say that you're preparing your students for a debate, a team versus team debate. And you're meeting with one team that's a little smaller, and this is a group of 12, and you're talking about all the strategies that they're going to use to bring evidence in support of a thesis in the limited amount of time they will have in a series of rounds. And you're assigning parts to each round in the debate, while the other 18 students do some reading that is related to their debate topic issue and that they're going to use in their contest against this group of 12. You can see how that you could then switch and go to working with the group of 18 while the group of 12 goes to a recorded lesson. So the teacher can hold novel study also in this format, or conduct a science experiment with the 12, or model a math problem or an art technique in a smaller, closely focused conversation, again, while a larger group completes a recorded interactive lesson. There are so many ways of doing this. All right, here's one that I use on debate day. And again, for convenience, this image is pretty simple, but you can arrange your class in all kinds of shapes to facilitate interpersonal connection and aesthetic beauty and a movement of energy and space among your students. But this is one more of the stable and flexible classroom formats you can use for Focus and Flow on debate day. You get the teams together so they can organize and share resources and adjust throughout the entire activity, while also speaking across the room to one another in a structured way that the teacher facilitates. This is a day when students truly take and control the stage. And there is a little bit of noise and there is a little bit of chaos, but it's within the contained structure, the flexibly contained structure of the debate activity. And classroom format and seating format is one of the ways in which you can continue to provide freshness and variety in this Focus and Flow format to keep it from becoming too static. And it's important that from classroom to classroom that you teachers talk about how you use this particular factor as another one of the design factors that can help you all to keep this method working at a high level without becoming stale for you and your students. And let's now talk more about how it is that we can get the advantages of focus and flow, not just in one's own classroom, but also throughout one's PLC or grade level or even entire school. And let's begin this by just understanding the long-term value of focus and flow. And this model is a statement that I'm creating from evidence-based observations and assumptions over years of work in this method in very difficult classrooms. All right, so we'll have two classrooms that we compare, but it's actually a before and after. Let's generously assume that in a distraction-prone class lasting 60 minutes, that teachers might get an average of 30 minutes of focus out of 60, if they can get 30. And of course, that would be without 30 continuous minutes. So the 60 would be broken up. But among that broken up hour, we get 30 minutes of focus here and there. Now let's conservatively assume that in the same group, but in a focus and flow format, teachers may get an average of 45 continuous minutes of focus. So there's a little bit of time to settle, and then there's a little bit of time at the end of the 60 minutes. That's a difference not just in terms of quantity, right, but also of quality. Okay, but let's start. Let's do a comparison then of the year-long concentration totals in terms of time for each one of these groups. If we have 185 school days in a year, and on the average day overall, teachers get 30 focused minutes out of 60, that means that those classes have spent 92 and a half days on task out of 185. About 50% of the time. This is miserable. And we know also that the quality of time was not such that there was 30 continuous minutes of focus and then 30 minutes of distraction. No, it was all jumbled up. It was a tornado. Let's compare that to the focus and flow format, where for 185 days, teachers get an average of 45 minutes of continuous focus out of 60 minutes on a daily basis. This would mean that they've spent nearly 139 days on task out of 185. Much better. It was actually the entire 185, but we're counting the minutes at the beginning and at the end of class in our minutes total. But if you want to look at just mathematically the difference here, 138.75 days on task, subtracting 92 and a half from that leaves more than 46 solid and complete days of time on task in an academic year. That's an entire academic quarter of time on task. Now let's consider that the focus and flow teacher worked efficiently and experienced less stress while getting this result. Didn't have to work harder for it, worked less hard, but worked more intelligently. And that the focus and flow classes' time on task was continuous and far more pleasant and productive. That the focus and flow students finished more work, a lot more work, felt less stress, and made higher growth, serving their families also. And that the focus and flow students drew fewer behavioral referrals and stayed in class more regularly, helping your classroom to stabilize the entire school. Now, the value of that happening in just one classroom for a school can be very significant. And now let's imagine putting that method to work across an entire PLC or in all the vulnerable classrooms throughout a grade level or even throughout a school. And what we have is a profoundly transformed learning environment where we use all of the design factors, including classroom strategy, getting every professional in the building focused on tuning this method to making it more effective for the student population. The transformation that occurs from this kind of coordinated effort can be extremely profound, with positive health benefits for everyone to boot because of the significantly lowered stress and the positive energy flowing through the building. Let's look a little bit more in depth at the details of just how it is that focus and flow teachers help their colleagues and help the families they serve. Once again, let's look at some pressure on principals, on RPCs, and on families. And here on this slide, we'll look at what those pressures are. And then in the next slide, we'll look at how it is that teachers address these pressures. Well, again, principals are facing two really big pressures. They want to stop the school to prison pipeline. They have a lot of pressure to do so, and they have a lot of inspiration within themselves to do it. This is one of the most compelling calls to action that a principal heeds in carrying out a leadership mission. And now when teachers make behavioral referrals, even for good reasons, pressure mounts. The superintendents scrutinize principals' decisions, and they urge actions that lower referrals and suspensions. Okay, so this is one of the pressures on principals. How can teachers answer that? Especially if the teachers are dealing with chaos. All right, principals also need to raise test scores and growth, social and emotional and academic. And we know that here a principal's job often hangs in the balance based on how well the school meets this objective, raising test scores and making strong growth. Now, this outcome requires excellent teaching and a consistent culture of attention in classrooms. This creates a conflict for principals. On one hand, they need rigor in those classrooms. On the other hand, they need you to tolerate a lot of distraction so that we can deal with behavior restoratively. The focus and flow method goes straight at solving that conflict. All right, let's look at pressures on RPCs, or restorative practices coordinators. Restorative practices coordinators, they want to stop the school to prison pipeline, and this may be the most intense and pressing of all the restorative practices goals that RPCs embrace. Some RPCs commit to this job in order to address this social imperative. It's their main motivation for getting into this work. The RPC feels pressure to help a school's and a district's leaders to meet this goal, to improve society. These RPCs tend to be very idealistic and motivated about this issue. And they also want to balance academic and social and emotional help. Students bond with RPCs because they offer soul-to-soul help. And part of the RPC's job is to listen and to counsel. In this context, turning the student's attention back to academics can prove to be a serious boundary-setting challenge for RPCs. Some students will tend to just skip class and go right to the RPC because they want more of that good conversation and connection. And it can be hard for the RPC to say no to that because we know that the effect of that counseling is so powerful and important. How can the teacher address those pressures? We'll wait to the next slide to talk about that. Pressures on families. And again, we have here competing pressures. On the one hand, families all want the teachers to grow their children's skill set. Parents know that a key to a child's future independence is a strong education. And a learning how to learn education and experience in each classroom is essential to that. Parents who have this goal know that disruption of that process has no place in their child's life. The time for education is right now. And there are a lot of schools in a district that will exploit this fact. Private schools particularly, any school that builds up a waiting list that is willing to protect the behavior and academic focus within class, they're going to exploit this. They're going to say to families, hey, we're ready to give your child a high quality learning experience right now. And behavior, distraction that's not tolerated. This is one of the major fracturing issues in our entire country in every district. Families want this. But families, especially of vulnerable children, feel a different concern. These parents want you to keep your child in class even if the child is distracting. Parents may have to take days away from work to attend to a suspended child. And one parent cannot replicate all teachers' work and still manage a home. It's just not possible. And if students begin to fail and lose ground in their skills, then a parent may feel deep worry for the child's future. An educated child who loves school brings peace to a whole household, and that's a child who's been able to stay in class. So these are the pressures that principals, RPCs, and families face. It's not all of them, but these are the major ones. Well, how do teachers address these pressures? Let's start with the principals again. Well, teachers help principals to stop the school to prison pipeline because they can calmly command the attention of challenging student groups without resorting to disciplinary tactics. And this kind of teacher can and will act to address this mission and reduce pressure of the school to prison pipeline, the focus and flow teacher can go straight at this goal with much more confidence. At the same time, that teacher can help to raise scores and growth and help that principal to perform well in the eyes of the district leadership. A teacher who wins attention from students on a consistent basis creates a growth promoting environment while also displaying work online for peer and administrative review every day. This gives a principal a lot more of a feeling of control, and that can ease tensions in the building as well. How about pressure on RPCs? How does the teacher using focus and flow help the RPC? Well, a teacher who needs to make fewer referrals to the RPC, first of all, lightens the restorative practice coordinator's load. And a teacher is also doing restorative work right there in the classroom. A teacher whose work is recorded also gives the RPC access to high quality material to keep students learning on pace in the RPC center. So the logistics again and the communication can be much improved here through focus and flow between teachers and RPCs. How does the teacher help the RPCs to set boundaries? Well, the answer is that, like the Centaur teachers who replicate themselves, RPCs can also create their own recordings to ensure that their best selves can show up every day on a range of important topics aimed at specific audiences. And RPCs can use these and the teachers' recordings to give students multiple structures and responsibilities at any given time. That is, to give multiple students structure and responsibility at any time, and it can be in different ways. And again, it becomes easy for the RPC to do that. All right, how does the teacher help families to address these important pressures? Let's look at the top one. A teacher helps to grow every child's skills by offering recorded content and in-person instruction at the same time, right? That can give all students a chance to tunnel through any distractions every day. And that means that the teacher can keep those students immersed in skill development, even if they are at home, if they're sick, or if they are suspended, the teacher can still be present in a strong and meaningful way. Well, how about the other way? How about if a parent is more concerned that their student will be suspended? Well, this method, focus and flow, makes it easier for the teacher to keep students in class and to attend to any behavioral difficulty a lot more calmly and attentively, de-escalating conflict before things get to the level of a behavioral referral. And this method also provides a much better opportunity for students who are in the restorative practices center, or the in-school suspension it was formerly called, because they can do their work in that other environment. There's just more options here for helping the child stay in class and in school. And again, if the child is suspended out of school, then the work is still available in an excellent form 24/7. Now imagine these benefits extending throughout a PLC, a grade level, or an entire school. All of the professionals in the building sharing their technical know-how, sharing their content coaching ideas, and also sharing materials. There's so much more help on the job. There's so much more ability here to focus positive energy on the academic and the social and emotional while eliminating the conflict between these competing pressures. This is the advantage, the set of advantages that schools and teams can get by learning to apply the focus and flow method. The Centaur method that I've been describing throughout this module will operate better in schools where leaders are also doing all of the other good things they can to help the culture to support a flourishing learning environment and social emotional growth environment. Let's talk about some of the factors that teachers and administrators can also affect in order to help their students to get a positive experience on a consistent basis in and outside of the classroom throughout the whole school environment. Despite all the uncertainty of the school year, there is one certainty we can look to begin to anticipate where we might want to concentrate on applying some of our methods and remedies for helping students to regather, focus, strive, and grow.
and one of them is the schedule of the year. We know when we're going to reach bi-quarterly reports. We know when we reach the end of a quarter and grades are coming. We know when we're reaching the end of a semester or a year, or a major mid-year or year-end test. These are great times to use restorative circles and to schedule PBIS celebration events. A problem with PBIS celebration events as designed for most schools is that most schools only conduct a PBIS celebration event, a major one, at the end of an academic quarter. So about every 9 to 10 weeks. This simply is not frequent enough for our most behaviorally troubled students to be able to make a connection and reflect on how their behavior leads to a consequence, in this instance, being able to participate in and get the full benefit of a PBIS celebration that is school-wide. One of my strongest recommendations here for actions schools can take outside of the Centaur method I've described is to make PBIS school-wide celebrations much more frequent. I would strongly recommend doing them at least every 3 weeks. That's not such a big change as far as the staging is involved, the work involved in getting that ready. But it gives students many more times both to succeed and also more chances to positively fail and reflect, and then gather up and try again. The difficulty here is that the students who violate behavioral principles and codes in the school most frequently, sometimes by the first 2 or 3 weeks, they have already disqualified themselves from a quarter end or a semester end celebration. And so we've exhausted our tools that we can use with them to hold a celebration as a possible reward for their striving. This simply isn't good enough, and it underserves our most needy students. Make it every 3 weeks at least. This is a meaningful time for reflection and regrouping and trying again. This would mean that schools offer 12 school-wide celebrations approximately, rather than just 4, with one of them coming at the very end of the year. That's simply not enough to encourage the kinds of changes we want to occur within the school year, where we can continue processing and reflecting. Another strong recommendation I'd like to make is that restorative circles not only be reactive in the wake of events that prompt reflection, but anticipatory. Anticipatory circles are a proactive method for helping students to reflect in advance of triggering events that might prompt them to act out from anxiety or anger or fear, and get them instead to feel the security and structure of the school culture around them as they strive for growth. Sometimes growth for a student will look like simply being willing to sit for an entire exam and make an effort rather than withdrawing, going to sleep, or acting out in anger to disqualify oneself for the test to avoid judgment. Anticipatory circles, again, we can build around the schedule and the year and the events that we know are coming that tend to give our students greater difficulty, together with anticipatory circles and the reactive circles that we need. And the PBIS frequency of celebrations school-wide throughout the year helps us to more firmly establish that frame of support and reflection that we want for our students and that we use in order to invite them into more reflection and trust in the school environment. And they simply need more opportunities to learn that they can trust the school environment. These cannot be islands that infrequently appear at great distances of time. We must make them more frequent so that they will be more meaningful and concretely present in the inner life of the students we most hope to change and help to grow. And so, in the spirit of reflection and improvement in our efforts to meet important and sometimes apparently competing objectives to raise academic growth while showing more tolerance for disruption in the classroom and all of the other conflicts that appear when we consider the multiple pressures that teachers, restorative practices coordinators, and administrators face. Let's look at research that comes out of the first major studies that scholars have conducted on effectiveness of restorative practices across large populations of teachers and large clusters of schools. This gives us compelling data that we need to consider, and as one might expect, the results that we get from these studies show an interesting mix, that we're making some progress, but we also see some areas where we definitely want to grow if we want to meet all of our goals and not just some. Let's move forward now and develop a critical awareness of studies that scholars have conducted so far about the impacts and levels of effectiveness of restorative practices in helping our schools to make the kinds of cultural, behavioral, and academic changes we're seeking so that our students can flourish. As of this recording, which I'm creating in March of 2022, so far scholars have conducted only 3 major studies on the impact of restorative practices. And this means that we're still in early days of how we learn to train faculties to implement restorative practices, what particular details of restorative practices have the most impact on what kinds of populations and on what sizes of schools. This is so multifactorial that we stand at the beginning of a long and important research path. And in that spirit, let's keep in mind that our main goal here is to develop a critical awareness of what these studies teach us and to think about how our own schools might compare to and differ from the impressions that emerge from these studies. Now, we will go into the 3 studies momentarily, but I'd like to frame them by making reference first to a National Education Association study from the year 2020. And it's important that we note the year because this is the last time that we had a study under normal education conditions before we went into schooling from home during the pandemic. So most of our research is also limited by that very profound change in how we're engaging with our students in a very fundamental way. So with that, let's turn to the study. And you can see the full article title there at the bottom. Restorative practices in schools work, but they can work better. And you could find the whole article there at the link provided or simply search it with the information given there at the bottom. And this passage here represents a key takeaway from the National Education Association's article. And we could even get that takeaway in the quote at the very top. We are at a critical juncture with how restorative practices are perceived. And let's look a little bit how. According to the NEPC brief, that's National Education Policy Committee brief, research shows that restorative justice programs have helped reduce exclusionary discipline and narrow the glaring racial disparities in how discipline is meted out in schools. And this pattern here is going to be repeated in some of the research we'll look into momentarily. The evidence is a bit more mixed or inconclusive on 2 other fronts, however, school climate and student development. And we're going to see that that pattern also bears out in the research I'll present to you momentarily. So we're getting mixed results. And there's a little bit of a warning here from one of the primary researchers who conducted this study from Rutgers University, Dr. Ann Gregory. A program that singularly focuses on reducing suspension, Gregory says, will fall short in capturing the prevention-oriented and systemic reform goals of restorative justice. So this aligns with what we've talked about so far in this module, that we want to develop approaches that help us to address all of the important pressures we face and not just one or the other. Moving on with the article summary. We're at a critical juncture with how restorative practices are perceived, says Dr. Gregory. Quote, we have to understand that for it to be successful, it has to be done in a comprehensive way. We're talking about whole school change, not just in the classroom, but in the hallways, and the introduction of new instructional models, she explains. And that's what the Centaur method is that I'm describing. It is a new instructional model. Final paragraph. Responsive restorative justice in education, or RJE, practices build accountability, promote social emotional growth, and support positive behaviors in schools, Gregory and Evans write, and the research I will cite does bear that out. However, if an RJE effort does not also address the need for preventative practices to transform school climate. The singular emphasis on behavior management may distort the initiative and preclude the opportunity to promote interconnectedness and well-being. So, in other words, what we need is we need a method or a set of steps and techniques that help us to gain whole transformation rather than fixating only on one particularly important part of that system. All right, so with that, let's move on now to the 3 studies we need to consider in order to get a deeper handle on what research shows us about the effectiveness of restorative practices so far. And what we see here in the list of studies is there at the top, where we'll begin, a 2-year study of 44 Pittsburgh public schools. Title of this article, Can Restorative Practices Improve School Climate and Curb Suspensions? All right, the second study, also a 2-year study featuring 2,771 middle school students in 13 schools across the state of Maine. And the title of this article is Evaluation of a Whole School Change Intervention, Findings from a 2-year cluster randomized trial of restorative practices intervention. All right. And then the survey at the bottom is titled Discipline Reform Through the Eyes of Teachers. And this study was conducted by the Fordham Institute in partnership with the Rand Corporation. And this survey involves opinions from over 1,200 teachers, grades 3 through 12, across the nation on the subject of discipline reform. These 3 studies are the only major studies of which I am aware after comprehensive searching through databases that give us some feedback on how we're doing with restorative practices. If you are aware of other major studies, please do feel free to reach out and let me know. I would love to update this section of the module. For our present purposes, we will take the National Education Association's assessment of restorative practices as our starting point. And again, that starting point states that we are seeing progress on reducing exclusionary discipline, moving more toward a supportive style of responding to difficult behaviors from students. And we're also starting to, in some ways, and the survey data here is uneven if you look across the literature set, that we're reducing the gap in suspensions as categorized by race. So we're making some progress here on equality and equity. However, we still have a way to go, and let's find out how now by looking at the 3 major studies we've started to investigate. Let's go to the Pittsburgh study first. And let's just introduce it. First of all, the Rand Corporation conducted one of the first rigorous evaluations of restorative practices as implemented in a city school district. They found that the practices had a positive effect in schools by reducing school suspensions. Here we get our first confirmation of what the NEA article has claimed. The study was conducted in the Pittsburgh Public Schools District in Pennsylvania, which serves approximately 25,000 students, K through 12, in 54 schools. The research team conducted a randomized controlled trial of restorative practices in 44 of those schools between June 2015 and June 2017, so again, 2 years. The 44 schools were evenly split between schools that adopted a specific program and control schools that did not. The analyses focused on program implementation as well as outcomes. And again, you can find the entire article to investigate it yourself right down there at the bottom of this particular slide. I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's fascinating. Let's look at some important findings from this study. Restorative practices did not positively affect all students in the treatment schools. This is an important takeaway. So despite fewer suspensions, and there's the good news, academic outcomes did not improve in the treatment schools. At the middle grade level, grades 6 through 8, academic outcomes actually worsened in the treatment schools. And suspension rates in those grades also did not change. So we don't have good news from all of the schools academically. And in terms of the middle schools, we didn't get a change in suspensions and academics worsened. Now, we don't have any discussion in the article as to why it occurred this way. My hypothesis
and it's based on years of experience, is that when we turn to favor addressing one particular pressure that we face in the classroom to the exclusion of others, then what we've done is we've let ourselves become narrowed by the pressures that we're facing. And so at this point, what we need is we need more research to ask, why did that happen that way? The operating hypothesis that I'm presenting to you in this module is that so far our restorative practices approaches have not enabled us to simultaneously address the many competing pressures that we face on a daily basis in the classroom and throughout the school. Let's proceed and learn a little bit more about the Pittsburgh findings. The writers state that it could be that it is more challenging for restorative practices to positively affect middle grade students, at least within a 2-year time frame. Let me pause again and say that if a 2-year time frame is not enough time for restorative practices to make the impacts that we desire, then we need to find a better way of implementing them. We need answers today. The focus of this module is on discussing a method where behavior transformation can occur on day one of implementation and remain steady throughout the period of application. 2 years is far too long to wait. In that time, teachers could burn out, principals could burn out or get fired. Turnover in staff could mean that people who got the training and restorative practices aren't there anymore. 2 years is too long to wait. We need answers right now, and that's the focus of this module. Let's go forward again and finish this slide. Additionally, the study showed that there was no change in the rate of suspensions for male students or students with individual education plans, and there was no reduction in the number of incidents of violence or arrests. This study did not demonstrate that restorative practices can be effective in curbing the most violent behavior, at least within a 2-year implementation period. And there again, if 2 years is not enough time, then we need to rethink how it is that we elicit attention within the student body to the programs we are creating. If all of the training and all of the good ideas simply remain quietly in the imaginations of the adults in the building, then they're not reaching the student population effectively. And what we want is to reach the student population in a constant and continuous and positive way. And that is one of the major contributions of the focus and flow method. Again, if we consider the Pittsburgh findings and then we look at this graphic that we've now studied rather carefully throughout this module, we see that in the effort to stop the school to prison pipeline by lowering reporting and reducing referrals, we have made progress. So in the Pittsburgh study, we have evidence that the schools made progress on those two very important objectives. However, what we saw is that we failed to recover lost time academically. We did not close achievement gap. And in fact, on high stakes testing and closing gaps, middle schools in Pittsburgh went backward. Why? I think the answer could be simple. It simply could be that in permitting more disruption in the schools to make important social gains, we lost some ground academically. Again, this is the operating hypothesis here. And what we need to do is make sure that we can protect academics for everybody, including the most disruptive students, and at the same time, achieve that lower reporting and stop the school to prison pipeline goal. I believe this is achievable, and the focus and flow method is what makes it possible. Okay, let's go on to the second study here. And this is from the study conducted in public middle schools in Maine. And again, we have here 2 slides. This first slide simply describes the structure of the experiment, and then we'll go straight to a core finding of the study in the second slide. So this study fills a gap in research on multi-level school-based approaches to promoting positive youth development and reducing bullying, in particular cyberbullying among middle school youth. The study evaluates the restorative practices intervention, a novel whole school intervention designed to build a supportive environment through the use of 11 restorative practices. For example, communication approaches that aim to build stronger bonds among leadership, staff, and students, such as using I statements,
encouraging students to express their feelings. And that had only quasi-experimental evidence prior to this study. So studying multi-level, that is, for example, individual, peer group, and school approaches like the restorative practices intervention is important because they are hypothesized to address a more complex interaction of risk factors than single-level efforts, which are more common. Bear in mind, please, again, that when we look at the slide that we've studied throughout this module, I'm talking about a complex interaction of multiple factors that we can address through a structure that permits us to steer attention in a compelling but non-forceful way. All right, one more point about the design of the study before we look at results. Baseline and 2-year post-survey data was collected from 2,771 students at 13 middle schools, evenly split between grades 6, 7, and 8. And the students surveyed were primarily 11 and 12 years old. Let's note that gender here was evenly split, 51-49, and 92% of the students were white in this study. Okay, looking at the survey data, we find that the intervention did not yield significant changes in the treatment schools. And we need to wonder why it is. This may not be an indication that the restorative practices models can't work. It could be that the training was not effective. It could be that teachers did not implement the training in their classrooms or did so unevenly. Or maybe they did it well, but not frequently enough. Again, there are so many factors here that we need to consider examining. But there's some good news that came out of this study. Let's read it. However, student self-reported experience with restorative practices significantly predicted improved school climate and connectedness, peer attachment, and social skills, and reduced cyberbullying victimization. So this is wonderful. While more work is needed on how interventions can reliably produce restorative experiences, this study suggests that the restorative model can be useful in promoting positive behaviors and addressing bullying. So in other words, we've made some headway here on positive school climate and a sense of the fairness of the culture from the perspective of the students, as well as an increase, I think we can say, in some of the features of PERMA, when we see here that the students state that school climate's better, that they have better attachments to their peers, their social skills improve, and the cyberbullying victimization is reduced. This is all an improvement of our, let's say, for example, positive relationships and positive emotions. And this is significant. But once again, what we've only done here is address a couple of factors and not all of them. We need more. And so now let's go to the third study. And this one is really the most difficult to absorb because the findings on teachers' responses to dealing with restorative practices show that there is a great deal of emotional labor that has stressed the teaching population and also divided it. And I think here in the Fordham Institute, conducted with the assistance of the RAND Corporation, we find ourselves contemplating the fragmentary issue, the most divisive issue in our national education community. And I would like to proceed through a discussion of this research article and its findings, again, with a critical awareness and with some effort to discuss critically some of the findings that the writers present. So what's significant about this survey is that it's national in scope. 1,219 teachers participated, teachers in grades 3 through 12. And the focus of this study was on low socioeconomic status urban schools. And let's get the introduction from the authors. The debate over school discipline reform is one of the most polarized in all of education. Advocates for reform believe that suspensions are racially biased and put students in a school-to-prison pipeline. And we see there that they've put that in quotes, so let's revisit that in a moment. Opponents worry that softer discipline approaches will make classrooms unruly, impeding efforts to help all students learn and narrow achievement gaps. All right, let's take that paragraph because there's quite a lot there. First of all, the quotes around the school-to-prison pipeline would suggest that the writers of this study regard that concept that there is a school-to-prison pipeline with some skepticism. And let's just consider for a moment a number of ways we could read that. because they're leaving it for the audience to make an inference about what those quotes actually mean. Let me remove myself from an attempt to understand the authors, and let me look at one way in which we could explain this. If we place full blame for the pathway to prison on the schools, then in some ways we narrow our vision and stop looking at public policy making on conditions and institutions outside of the school, which might be even more important factors in that pathway to prison pipeline. So if the authors mean to encourage us to look at other sociological conditions, other economic conditions, other cultural conditions broadly that perpetuate this pattern, then I'm in favor of their suggestion to think more broadly. However, if they mean to deflect any kind of thought about the schools playing a role in this, then I'm inclined to resist their suggestion. Okay, that's the first critical point I'd like to raise in going through this. We can look also at some of the diction in this opening paragraph. Opponents were that softer discipline approaches. Well, the word softer here, I think, is also meant critically. Well, certainly it is softer than the zero tolerance policies that some states have adopted, which have shown to be very inadequate in helping to actually reform student feelings and student behavior in the schools. A merely punitive approach has not worked. And so we should not, I think, feel any kind of hesitation to go for something quote unquote softer. Well, what if softer can be more effective? And I think that's what we want, and that's what I'm presenting in Focus and Flow. Something that leans much, much, much less into the disciplinarian mode, but much more into a kind of captivation and fascination with material that we can get our students to buy into simply by a different method of communication. Okay. Now, to conclude that opening paragraph, the authors raise the importance of the achievement gap as an equally important, if not transcendent, goal. And in that regard, I agree. We need to focus every student's attention on content for their benefit and for overall our society's benefit. All right, let's look at the second paragraph. To determine how practitioners, that is teachers, see this complex issue of behavior, we partnered with the RAND Corporation to survey a nationally representative sample of more than 1,200 teachers in grades 3 through 12. And because racial and socioeconomic equity is a key consideration in the discipline debate, we oversampled African American teachers and teachers in high poverty schools to ensure that their views were represented, something not attempted in any prior discipline survey. Okay, so in the next slide, we see the 5 key findings that the Fordham Institute drew from their survey data results. And let's look at them. And the first one is that teachers in high poverty schools report higher rates of verbal disrespect, physical fighting, and assault. And most of the teachers say that a disorderly or unsafe environment makes learning difficult. And as we'll confirm with reference to some of the studies I'll get to a little further on in this section, this has been a consistent pattern going back at least 40 years. So we get another confirmation that difficult classroom behavior makes learning difficult. Okay, seems intuitive, but it's good to have formal research confirmation. Second finding is most teachers say that discipline is inconsistent or inadequate, and that the recent decline in suspensions is at least partly explained by a higher tolerance for misbehavior or increased underreporting. And when we look back at the graphic we've explored throughout this model, and we look at pressure on administrators to lower reporting, well, apparently, according to this study, some teachers perceive that administration is under that pressure, simply not talking about or showing what is happening within the school. And this may or may not be true, but this is an impression that came out in the teachers surveyed nationally. And again, this is a point of division between administrators and teachers. And what I hope we can do here in this module, especially if we're
participating in this learning module as a mixed group of administrators and teachers, that we can stick together here as we consider all of this. Because let's be compassionate toward each other. We're facing some of the hardest issues that anyone faces in any profession. It's extraordinarily complex. Third finding, although many teachers see value in newer disciplinary approaches, such as positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, and restorative justice, most also say that suspensions can be useful and appropriate in some circumstances. And again, this puts us right back in that tension where we don't want to risk suspensions because it takes students out of school. It could put them into cycles where they continue to fall behind and again risk the school to prison pipeline phenomenon. Fourth finding, most teachers say that the majority of students suffer because of a few chronically disruptive peers, some of whom should not be in a general education setting. Very controversial statement here. But this idea that a majority of students, say you have 70, 80, even 90% of students ready to learn in a classroom and can't do so because of just a few disruptive peers, this turns out to be a pretty common experience from teachers who are trying to engage the large majority of their students and can't do so because they are bound to keep one or even two small number of disruptive students in their classes who change the entire learning environment. And that's what the focus and flow method helps to prevent. Okay, so let's look at the fifth finding. Despite the likely costs for students who misbehave, and let's be clear, those likely costs are suspensions, falling behind academically, even school to prison pipeline. Despite the likely cost for students who misbehave and their belief that discipline is racially biased, many African American teachers in the survey say that suspensions, expulsions, and other forms of, quote, exclusionary discipline, quote, should be used more often. Okay, this is a really very controversial statement. And the word many on many African American teachers, I think, is unfortunately imprecise. It would be good there to have a percentage on this statement. And again, what we find here is perhaps a simple point. And that is that no matter what the race of the teacher, everyone wants to be respected in the classroom. And that certainly when we feel respected as teachers, we experience better quality of life. We feel that we are more effective in the classroom and that our students form a better bond to the whole learning process. I think that's a key takeaway that I draw from this. Another is that discipline is extremely personal and it transcends racial categories. I think we find teachers of every race who either take personally the way students treat them or who take personally a mission to react to student misbehavior in a therapeutic way. And this is one of the key factors in getting training for restorative justices, is that we look at student behavior not as a personal attack on the teacher, but as a representation of where the student is in the student's interpretation of a social relationship. And this is an object of teaching. If a student doesn't know how to do math, we teach the math. Well, here in this case, if the student doesn't know how to behave, we teachers will then commit to teaching the behavior. But our approaches to doing that vary widely, and this is why restorative practices can be so difficult to implement, because of our personal diversity in terms of how we value discipline and respect on a personal level. Okay, before we go on to discuss additional studies which can give us some more context for interpreting the findings of these three major studies, let's just reflect on what we find from all three. We unfortunately don't find from any of the three major studies that restorative practices have helped us to improve academics. Specifically, if we go to the 8 o'clock figure on this graphic, that we haven't recovered lost time. that we haven't helped our students to overcome gaps in learning through the implementation of these models. And this keeps us steeped in the difficult pressures that wear us down and that divide us. And that's something that we simply must improve. If we feel that we have addressed the gap in suspensions by race, that we have lowered the school to prison pipeline, that we have lowered reporting, and we've done so in a way that we feel is legitimate and therapeutic, well, then we've done a great job addressing some major social pressures. And at the same time, unfortunately, we have failed to address another important pressure of recovering lost time. And in the meantime, we've experienced a lot of stress because we feel that tension. We feel ourselves being pulled in opposite directions. And if we've done poorly on high stakes testing, we might even find ourselves pushed out of a job in spite of our social progress. This is simply so unfair. And if there's one point on which I hope we can all agree in this module, it's that we need, for so many reasons, to improve our ability to address these pressures happily and simultaneously and for the benefit of everyone. And with compassion and with thoughtfulness and with an effort at being strategic and open in our communication. I think the focus and flow method, adapted to each unique environment by the creative professionals in the building, can help us to do that. It can help us to get that transformation.
The Fordham Institute's troubling and challenging finding that teachers, despite their race, find that in high poverty schools, student behavior remains overwhelming, shows us that we teachers and administrators and restorative practices counselors are operating in a larger social and economic matrix that predisposes students to behaviors that make learning more difficult. And personally, I'm a strong advocate for getting the social and economic changes that we need in order to address persistent inequalities that continue to put us into the same patterns of misunderstanding and conflict. And separately, I'm an advocate for programs such as strong universal 0 to 3 education and family and community networking from even before birth in order to address problems like the gap in literacy, which can begin with language training habits and processes that begin in the home and neighborhood from age 0 to 3 before the schools ever become involved. However, as we continue to team together to work on these larger issues and structures that we can put into place to address those issues, we need practical tools to help things work better right now. And we need that for everybody. And we can do it because here is a fact. We're all capable of becoming fascinated. We're all capable of having our attention drawn into a world of ideas that awakens imagination, that changes our heart rate, that changes our breath, that changes our physical experience, puts us in a place of safety and wonder. Using technology in simple ways, and I think potentially in the future in more complicated ways, perhaps through virtual reality, we can give our students a chance to pause from the story that dominates their lives, the stories of conflict, and draw them into the wider stories given to us by the beauty of our content. We can simply create a structure of communication that affords them much greater access to it every single day. And this is one powerful tool that we can add to addressing all of the urgent issues in the limited amount of time we have to address them in our schools together.
And as we move forward together in determining how it is we can most effectively move forward with restorative practices in a context that improves academics, that very effectively addresses the achievement gap and helps us to establish a vibrant human community, well, we need to consider how it is
that we can improve all of the conditions in the school for all of the important actors, students, teachers, and administrators. As we saw in the Fordham study, we see a lot of conflict in how teachers and administrators would like to handle discipline in order to meet extremely important social objectives on which we can never give up. We can never give up on needing to create racial justice and to create equality, and beyond that, to improve the quality of life for everyone in our schools. And this means that we're going to need to change our normal way of operating. We can see that excluding students from the school community does not help those students to improve. In fact, it may put them, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that it deepens their risk for disengaging from school and getting onto a much more troubling path. So we've got to change that. And at the same time, we need to help all of the schools function on a high level of rigor so that we can make academic progress, which is to say, professional and economic progress and cultural progress also. All right, so let's now begin to consider some supporting evidence from additional studies, which supplies a broader conversation for interpreting the data that we saw in the three major studies that we have so far in restorative practices. And I've selected the following studies because they are either one of the rare additions to the body of literature we have on restorative practices, or because they typify what we will see in the body of research literature on a particular issue, such as in the first case here on teacher burnout and disruptive student behavior. Now, this article is from the year 2013 in the journal Motivation and Emotion. And the title of it is Toward a Theoretical Model to Understand Teacher Emotions and Teacher Burnout in the Context of Student Misbehavior. Appraisal, regulation, and coping are the three factors that the author Mei-Lin Chang considers. And let's look at the introduction to this article. In a recent national survey conducted by the American Psychology Association, novice teachers reported classroom management issues as top challenges. Okay, here again, the focus and flow method focuses on this top challenge. This finding is consistent with literature on teacher burnout, which indicates the most significant contributing factor to teacher burnout is disruptive student behavior. And let's look at the articles that Mei-Lin Chang cites in support of this point. There's an article from 1982, from 1985, 2002, and 2004. We have there, over a 20-year period, confirmation across those decades that the most significant contributing factor to teacher burnout is disruptive student behavior. This has been a problem for an extremely long time. Here we are in 2022, 20 years on, and this is still a major factor in teacher emotional labor and teacher burnout. I think it is safe to infer from this data and from our present conversation that for the last 40 years, teachers have struggled mightily with this issue. The focus and flow method is aimed at addressing the pain of that and alleviating the consequences of it for everyone, including the students who need to move on from conflict in their classrooms so that they can get an education that benefits them in all the areas of their lives. Continuing with the introduction, in 1991, Pintrick attempted to call our attention to the emotional issues in education by noting that, quote, emotions are intimately involved in virtually every aspect of the teaching and learning process, and therefore, an understanding of the nature of emotions within the school context is essential. Nonetheless, there's a notable lack of published research on the relationships among teacher emotions, classroom management, and teaching practice in the field of educational psychology. And to a great extent, this is still true. And what came out in the Fordham study is that teachers appear to be continuing to deal with high levels of emotional labor and repression of their emotions within the context of disruptive classrooms. Let's look at part of the conclusion of this article from Dr. Chang. And what we get to, and I want to summarize here before I go into it,
is the importance of how the teacher separates from the tension of the moment, the heat of the moment, to make an appraisal of what the student actually means if the student is acting out, and then what the teacher's job is in that moment in responding. Let's look. In the existing literature, student misbehavior is considered as the top source of teacher stress and teacher burnout. Less is known about the emotional processes associated between student behavior and teacher burnout. Now, this article, this is where this gets interesting. Instead of drawing a direct line from student behavior to teacher emotion outcome, in other words, instead of just blaming students, the present study attempts to discern the processes by examining teacher appraisals. And here's where we look at not student behavior, but teacher behavior. And this is a very important factor. And this is a challenge I want to invite my fellow teachers to take on. It's one that I've taken on myself in 20 years. Extremely hard to do, but we can make a lot of movement in our classrooms and in our lives if we do so. The present study attempts to discern the processes by examining teacher appraisals, regulation, and coping in the face of student misconduct. Results of this study identified the important roles of appraisals in the account of teacher anger frustration. So, for example, if a student confronts me repeatedly in a way that provokes me, I will feel anger and frustration. But then the next step is going to hinge on how I appraise what the student actually means and needs and what it is that I need to do in that situation. Now, one thing I like about Focus and Flow is that it removes audiences, student audiences, from such encounters, which greatly simplifies these student-teacher interactions. Simplifies them and makes them easier because the lesson still goes forward due to the captivating nature and just the sensory nature of the walling out and the drawing in effect of the design of communication. So it makes that easier. It also makes it less frequent. Okay, let's go forward with the rest of this conclusion. Thus, while classroom misbehavior will continue to be a challenge for many teachers, the authors here believe teacher educators or school administrators should help teachers increase their competency in dealing with classroom disruptive behaviors, such as adopting culturally responsive classroom management. And interestingly, this writer is making this claim nearly 9 years ago, and with reference to articles appearing more than 20 years ago in one case. The writer also encourages teachers to reflect upon goals and judgments about disruptive classroom behaviors so as to adjust their instructional goals to be better prepared for dealing with subsequent students' disruptive behaviors. The Focus and Flow method aims directly at doing so and in a way that not only doesn't compromise academics, but I believe accelerates them. Author concludes, for example, instead of judging students as disrespectful, teachers are better served by learning to understand how students behave and the reasons behind their behavior so that they can address those. Well, that is a great challenge, and let's be clear, that does demand emotional labor on the part of the teachers to make that separation in an angering and frustrating context, and then reposition oneself not to respond in kind to the student, but to respond kindly and thoughtfully. This does require a lot of restraint and skill and reflection. I think it requires physical techniques of relaxation and breath to help oneself to carry off this technique successfully. And if we want our teachers to do that, then we need to reassure them that they can do so. If we can turn to this graphic one more time, while helping teachers feel reassured that they have a system in place to help them continue to meet all of these other pressures as they engage in these difficult interactions with students who need compassion and patience in order to get a chance to receive help from their schools. Okay, let's go on to the next article, and we just have two more here. This is from a dissertation published in 2019 on 2 schools that implemented restorative practices, and the study follows the restorative practice implementation over the course of an entire school year. And this is one of the key findings from this dissertation. The dissertation is titled A Relational Approach to Discipline,
a comparative case study of restorative justice implementation in 2 United States secondary schools. So here we have a study of high schools. Now, the writer concluded that there are significant barriers to implementing restorative practices, and they're listed here at the top of this slide, A, B, and C. One is that there are a lot of resources required for successful implementation. Secondly, we need teacher and administrative buy-in. And then third, what are the priorities of the leaders in the school and the district? Here, I think we focus on the school in making sure that everybody keeps restorative practices approaches front and center. Let's read this section here that begins resources. And this is very important to consider. And again, this is another point that the focus and flow method helps us to address. All right, resources. One of the greatest challenges when implementing restorative justice was the amount of resources it requires. Resources such as time, money, training, and space, and were identified as constraints in previous studies. Prior to the implementation process, administrators or planning teams must have time to develop a shared vision, develop a framework for practice, and plan for the implementation process. To begin the restorative justice implementation process, schools need to be able to provide training to school personnel, which requires either time away from school responsibilities or time outside of regular school hours. We can see the difficulties here where the chances for things to fall through grow as the complexity of implementation grows. Okay, training can occur prior to the school year, but it requires prioritizing restorative justice over other professional development needs. So in other words, it can be pushed to the edges of other important concerns. And that's what we've been talking about the whole time. There's just so many concerns we need to be aware of and continue to address. In addition to time, training requires funds for materials and the cost of the trainers. Colleagues, this is one more advantage of the focus and flow method. All you need in order to change your classrooms and reproduce your presence and alter the flow of attention in your room is a decent microphone and free recording software. And then you'll be set. Working as a team, this becomes even better. And tune your method according to the design factors, and you will transform your classroom environment. Final line of the slide. While the school can decide to have school personnel trained as trainers, it requires upfront resources of time and money. These are significant barriers in moving from a good idea and a good intention to actual daily concrete practices. This is extremely important to keep in mind. Let's look at a concluding thought, and we get a quote from one of the teachers, the writer of the dissertation interviewed. So more on resources. Resource requirements do not necessarily diminish after initial implementation. Community building practices such as circles require time in the school schedule and places for various smaller class communities to meet, which can be challenging in schools with more teachers than classrooms. And even with time allotted in the schedule, competing needs and interests can get in the way of community building time. Gabe, one of the teachers interviewed, discussed the challenge of balancing circles with what students perceived they needed to spend their time on. Here's a quote of this teacher. Teacher states, "When busy season comes around, circles are the first thing that go." Is using those practices. Because now I have to get kids focused on stuff. And for kids too, they think, quote, "I don't want to sit here and talk about my problems, I'm stressed." But that would be the perfect thing to use to help kids really debrief where they're at and what supports they need. Things are great when they first start off, and when we get busy is when we kind of want to abandon ship. This quote really gives us a sense of how hard it is on a practical level to follow through on the ideas that inspire us at heart. Final line of this slide. Sustaining community and relationship building through the ebb and flow of busyness in schools can be challenging. However, circles are not the only restorative justice practices that require a lot of resources. Okay, I would again invite you to read the whole dissertation we learn a lot by looking at all of the details of these valuable and, again, new experiments going on in our attempt to assess how are we making progress right now. From my experience, and from my experience as a researcher as well, I know that the simplest, quickest, and most effective change that I've been able to bring to challenging classrooms is to reproduce my presence, to change the deep grooves of attention through which student energy flows on a daily basis with a very simple technological approach that helped me to address all of the pressures that we see on this representation of concerns that occupy teachers' minds around the clock. Let's look at one more slide representing findings from another article. And here the article is Using Restorative Practices to Reduce Racially Disproportionate School Suspensions. And the subtitle is important. The barriers school leaders should consider during the first year of implementation. And this is the most recent of all these studies. This is from the year 2021, conducted by researchers at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And in this article, we go back to some of the positive changes we've seen on improving school culture and improving the fairness of discipline practices. But we continue to see questions about the academics. Let's go into the article. Writer states, the psychosocial and improved school climate benefits have led many schools to utilize restorative practices as a means to significantly reduce overall school suspensions. We get a number of articles citing evidence for this. In one urban school setting, administrators and teachers reported that restorative practices improved student attitudes, and here we get an academic claim, analytic skills, ability to apologize, emotional intelligence, and created a stronger academic culture versus an environment of punishment. Okay, this is great news. And this is one particular school. So maybe that school excelled in implementation, and we need to delve more into this. These improvements were also associated with a significant decline of violent acts. Same article. Similar psychosocial effects were found within a school using the IIRP's Safer, Saner Schools Restorative Practices model. Student survey results across 29 high school classrooms revealed that the use of restorative practices was associated with positive teacher-student relationships and a reduction in discipline referrals compared to teachers not using restorative practices. So we get some excellent outcomes here that do touch on positive academic improvements as well. The writer comes back later in the article, however, to mention this, that at the district level, a randomized controlled trial displayed reduction of overall and racially disproportional school suspensions for elementary school students. And despite indication that restorative practices can reduce disproportionality, this has remained largely inconsistent across studies, or has been associated with negative academic outcomes. And what we need here again is more research to ask, why is it that if we improve on suspension rates and improve on a culture of fairness, that we either get no academic movement or we get negative academic outcomes, as we saw in the Pittsburgh study. And this is where we are in terms of the national research picture that emerges on our attempts to not just develop ideas of restorative practices, but important follow-up step, implementing them. And the focus and flow method is a way of helping restorative practices to be implemented more effectively and concretely. The focus and flow model lightens the load on teachers in every vulnerable classroom in a building, and lightens the load of the restorative practice coordinator, while also amplifying the presence and resources of each of those professionals in the building every single day, while improving their communication and logistics. And if a principal will orchestrate implementation of this method with all of these professionals in the building,
then we can start to get energy flowing in a positive direction on all of the pressures we need to address. Let's now segue to a conclusion of this important discussion of the research context for proposing focus and flow. And let's come back here where we started at the article written by the National Education Association. We are at a critical juncture with how restorative practices are perceived. But I think we are agreed upon one important point. We cannot and will not turn back from making our schools places of fairness, places of restorative justice, places of safety for all of our students. What is clear, as the National Education Association indicates, we need to improve at how we implement restorative practices. There are many points along the chain that we need to consider. The ideas and philosophies themselves, the training procedures, the frequency of those training procedures, the implementation process, which is carried out ultimately by teachers in different kinds of classrooms, in different academic subjects. And teachers are not all the same. They have different personalities who have different starting points in thinking about discipline and in making appraisals of student emotion and action. So this is very complicated, and I think in order to make restorative practices more effective, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to simplify this for teachers in the implementation process. Focus and flow helps us to do that. And to come back to this slide here, if we can get focus and flow working, such a burden can be lifted and from everyone's shoulders. That looks like fairness to me. And I hope that we can achieve that outcome together. And in that spirit, I'd like to transition now to the seventh and penultimate section of this whole module, section 7, which focuses on working together and sustaining our idealism and taking action. So, fellow teachers, it benefits us to understand the pressures that dominate the minds of our principals when they are taking on the challenge of leading a school that is disruption prone and at risk of intervention on the part of the district or the state. On one hand, the principals are taking on a very hard challenge of trying to transform behavior indirectly. They can't do it directly themselves. They have to do it through policy making and through culture. This is a great challenge. And there is not a single principal who wants to be noticed as the one who has suspended the most children. This is a mark of shame in their career. Around the district, principals will wonder, I wonder why that principal is suspending so much. I wonder why that principal seems so comfortable putting kids into the school to prison pipeline. These are the kinds of pressures that principals react against when they start to receive behavioral referrals, especially if the numbers begin to climb. However, on the other side, principals start to feel a lot of pressure when they do not provide adequate support to teachers calling for administrative intervention to deal with constant misbehavior, which of course undermines the academic mission. There's a pressure that comes from a third direction, and that is that principals will be hired or fired based on the academic growth and proficiency and test scores that come at the end of each year. But how does a school earn higher scores? By paying close attention and having classrooms that function. So if a principal takes measures to improve the learning environment by suspending or removing students from the environment, well, then perhaps academic growth can climb. However, in doing so, the principal has paid a cost in terms of the number of behavioral referrals going up and suspensions going up. It seems like a situation where a principal cannot win. So we teachers need to do something to help those principals more effectively meet these competing pressures and address them effectively. And at the same time, we teachers can handle the pressures that are coming at us in the classroom. Let's talk about some of the pressures we face. We need our students to respect us and know that they can't just get away with anything, that we, in fact, are sharing the classroom with them, but if we need to do so, we can take control of it and create a gentle but firm order that enables learning to go forward. So we need to be strong. However, sometimes that means that we'll need to make behavioral referrals for administrative support to help us enforce a culture that values learning. If our principals don't answer our calls for help, we can begin to feel a little bit demoralized, and students can begin to learn that, oh, this teacher doesn't have any power to escalate the authority. So we can continue to get away with what we're doing because we won't face a real consequence. So we take steps to make calls home, to arrange for restorative circles, to help students shift their perspectives. But that's very time consuming. And as that time goes on, we're continuing to lose the battle in class. And so we start to fall behind in getting the results of academic growth and proficiency that we teachers also feel we must meet in order to keep our jobs and be successful. And after all, deliver meaning, engagement, and purpose every day in our shared quest with the students. So we feel multiple competing pressures as well. Quite frankly, principals and teachers need a solution that can work more quickly. And this is one of the primary needs that the focus and flow method can help you to address. Creating a world unto itself for each student that carves deeper grooves of attention for those students and then holds them safely within them so that they can grow themselves through interactive activity that relies on their imagination as the power to propel the whole process forward. This is how we get academic growth. And as a reward for their risk, they can see that it really pays off and that they can form an identity as a student and that that identity can not only be safe, but it can be joyful.
And teachers, it behooves us to look very closely at this. So let's go through these issues and understand how it is that principals make their way through a difficult day in a disruption-prone school. And then from that understanding to look at how we as focus and flow teachers can help them. Now, let's look at the 12 o'clock position. Principals perceive pressure that they need to support teachers. They want to establish a culture of trust and mutual respect. Now, that's challenged when teachers call for help and principals give it to them. And then the district leadership starts to say, you can't let your teachers control you. You can't let them ask for too much from you. Well, in this case, the principal wants to at least give forthright communication about administrative decisions that go against teachers' requests. I didn't follow up on this behavioral referral in this way because of, and then the principal wants to give a good reason. The risk here is that if the principal goes with the superintendent's pressure to deny referrals or to handle them with a rather light response to a disciplinary infraction, then the teachers can start to lose morale, and a gap can start to open between the principal's leadership and the teachers' willingness to follow. So the principal, in managing this extremely complicated polarity, needs to be strong with teachers and strong with students, but taking too disciplinarian or rigid an approach will harm both student and teacher morale, quite possibly. And taking too lax an approach to steering school climate leaves no one in charge, essentially, and very much harms trust, and leaves teachers isolated to operate as they see fit, but without the guarantee that they will receive support. So principals feel a real challenge here to find an effective middle way in managing the pressure that flows to them from the superintendent's office and then the pressure that flows upward from the teaching population in the building. So principals also want to stop the school-to-prison pipeline, as we've discussed. This means helping disruptive students remain in the classroom rather than serve suspensions, lose ground, or start on a possible pathway to institutional discipline. Now, in taking that action, if it entails keeping disruptive students in the classroom, let's go across to the 9 o'clock position and look at high-stakes testing. District-level drive for higher test scores is intense.
And such growth requires steady engagement and attention and retained learning. Principals can keep or lose their jobs on this factor alone, but if they are making sacrifices of attention and learning culture to stop the STPP, arguably an even more important social mission, then they feel that they're having to sacrifice one important thing for another. And this is so unfair for principals. It's so incredibly hard. Well, let's look at the 8 o'clock position here again. Recovering lost time, overcoming the achievement gap, helping students who are behind grade level in reading and math. Once again, this aligns with enforcing attention in the school. But if you enforce attention in the school by suspending, either in-school suspension to a restorative practices center or at-home suspension, then the principal is risking the school-to-prison pipeline phenomenon again. This conflict is so incredibly difficult to master. It may be impossible. In fact, some principals have lost their jobs or have left the field because of the impossibility, it seems, of addressing these competing pressures effectively at the same time. Of course, let's look now at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock positions. For principals to stay motivated and idealistic in the midst of this, especially as a year grinds on with quite a lot of difficulty in classrooms, it feels almost impossible or false to be motivated and idealistic. And this is very sad when this happens to a well-trained, passionate, and idealistic principal. And it does happen because this problem is so complicated. And for principals to keep the high road, handling complaints from families, from students, and teachers, while under multiple pressures from the superintendent's office, this challenges a principal's patience and capacity for objectivity. And yet, where passions flare, a principal must exude calm and resolve. This requires so much impulse control and emotional labor on the part of principals, and they deserve the help and compassion of teachers. A principal who's going to lead in a school like this needs steady stress relief, and this is similar for teachers. And again, quite a lot of this pressure comes from the need to move student populations forward and get academic and social and emotional growth all moving in a positive direction at the same time, while, let's look at the 10 o'clock position, lowering reporting on behavior, lowering at least the referrals. This balancing of district and teacher demands, competing teacher demands, feels nearly impossible. It's very stressful for principals. And yet the principals also want to help the families by providing safe and focused classrooms that also keep disruptive students in school. This is such an overwhelming challenge, and principals take on so much responsibility for the results of the school year that if they feel alone in managing these pressures, if they think that teachers don't or can't understand, then they're going to feel a stress that may be impossible to relieve, at least within the context of the work setting. But we know what can happen when a teacher firms up discipline and culture in the classroom through the focus and flow method. Let's look at some of the unique features of the pressures that RPCs face. One, of course, at the top is to support high-need students. Students come to the RPC for help instead of suffering a suspension. And these students can be very hard to manage, and yet the RPC must forge a bond, and this can only be done in person, especially to start. But the RPC also then needs to maintain good boundaries and keep students connected to teachers and administrators in the midst of conflict. And the RPC does all this while carrying the banner of a principal's restorative mission, for real and daily. This person's level of performance needs to be very high. The pressure is constant, especially in a very disruption-prone school. And while that's going on, let's look at the 6 o'clock position. The RPC needs to keep the high road, handling complaints from so many directions. And like the principal, where passions flare, the RPC must lead calmly from heart and principle. This demands impulse control and very high emotional labor. Let's look over at the 4 o'clock position, because I think this is a factor that is very underestimated in the experience of RPCs in terms of what other people perceive. The RPC can can become so isolated and experience difficulty that flows from the irregularity of their schedules. The RPC's schedule and student roster and role may differ significantly every day without necessarily being predictable. The RPC has few, if any, peers in the same role, and this can feel very isolating. The focus and flow method can help the RPC to connect with colleagues throughout the building and feel much more effective in getting the school's shared mission accomplished. All right, of course the RPC is extremely motivated to stop the school to prison pipeline by helping disruptive students remain in the classroom or at least in the school rather than serve out of school suspensions and lose ground or start on that possible pathway to institutional discipline. The RPC also wants to balance this, and let's look at the 3 o'clock position here, to let discipline in the school serve everybody. The desire to keep disruptive students in school should never interfere with the majority of students' right to excellent learning opportunities. Part of restorative practices is that a whole school benefits, not just individuals. So stemming suspension rates must not at the same time stem academic progress. This is very difficult to do, and the focus and flow method is aimed at eliminating this conflict where we don't have to choose one or the other. Let's go over to the 9 o'clock position, role complexity. While RPCs are not teachers or administrators, they play roles that are proper to both. They play really difficult roles proper to both, while at the same time managing their unique duties. This can add to their isolation and frustration. Okay, now let's look at the 10 o'clock position, lower reporting. The RPC has slightly a different experience of this. The district requests fewer behavioral referrals and more in-school management of classroom behaviors. And the RPC absorbs a lot of this pressure. Principals lean on RPCs to help balance the district demands and the teachers' classroom needs. Well, if teachers in every vulnerable classroom around the school are using focus and flow, this is going to relieve a lot of this pressure and then help. Let's take for a last point on this slide, help to recover lost time. The principal, the restorative practice coordinator, the teachers, everyone wants to be working toward this goal of closing achievement gaps and lifting students who are behind grade level in reading and math into comparable performance and happiness also with their peers in feeling like reading and math are really for them. They want them to be part of their lives. Well, we can't do this if we're not getting that time on task. The competing pressures here are so overwhelmingly complex that we need more structure to help us sort it out and address them all simultaneously. And we can get that when restorative practice coordinators too replicate themselves and work with teachers who are at least in vulnerable classrooms doing the same thing in disruption-prone schools. And when we use this method in combination, there's so much more energy and help on the job, making everything more pleasant and also more effective for everyone involved. Again, here in this graphic, we envision the difference of 2 schools, one with the option to use the method, and then the other confining itself to the conventional approach. And again, here's another advantage of focus and flow. Teachers in the focus and flow format can choose the conventional approach. It's still there for them, equally as much as it ever was. But the focus and flow teachers also have so many options in addition to the conventional to help meet the needs of their student populations, and thus to cultivate the dimensions of PERMA that give us a clear way of thinking about what it is that we want to create together in our limited time. We want to experience positive emotions as we're working toward our difficult goals. We want to feel engagement that propels us through that process. And we want to form positive relationships throughout that whole journey. And this work feels meaningful from every perspective in the room. And when it leads to accomplishment, then we feel that all of our trust and our faith and our work has been deeply rewarded. And all of this supports our vitality. All of it supports our health, social, emotional, mental, and physical, and spiritual. This is why we do this work. And this is why focus and flow can be so important. Envision changing your classroom in the ways we've described in this module. Envision these changes coming to your entire grade level or PLC, or to your entire school, or even throughout your district. We can do this, and this is the mission that I am trying to encourage schools to embrace and carry out according to their own unique visions. We have a lot to learn from one another, and I hope that this module is just the start of a very rich dialogue that can unfold about how we develop and deploy Centaur methods in our vulnerable classrooms and continue to improve them in the years to come.
So now I'll make a statement that in the overall context of this module might sound surprising, but here's my belief. Nothing can ever replace the human-to-human relationship. Nothing replaces that. No technology will ever replicate what a real human relationship can do. Here's the paradox. Sometimes, in order for us to establish that human-to-human connection, we need technology to help us to mediate the interface. And that's what I've found through using the Centaur method for years in my classroom. Some classrooms simply were too easily dominated by charismatic students who felt a strong incentive to interrupt and thereby win social approval as in a way, a kind of leader of the classroom. While I appreciate that, I know that I can't let it go forward because I have very limited amount of time to help my students make important gains and discover that there are worlds available to them through all kinds of reading and writing and debating and conversation activities that are interpersonal. So it's the type of interpersonal reaction that we want to help to bring about through this Centaur method that I've discussed. We come into the classroom again every day from a positive expectation baseline. And then we rebuild and structure the interpersonal from there. So please make this one of the major takeaways from this whole module. This method does not and cannot and should not ever take out the interpersonal. Use it to cultivate the interpersonal. This is essential. Continue to make this the most important of all the design factor considerations as you apply this method in your classroom, with your colleagues, and possibly throughout your school and district. Before we transition to the final section of this module, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm excited in knowing that in speaking this message out to an audience, I'm aware that that audience consists of creators, scholars, activists, innovators, people who are doing really important work in their classrooms and learning how to make things better for their students and the families they're serving. And I would like to propose that this module is a start in an ongoing dialogue for how we can continue to improve our strategies and our concrete follow-through on those strategies in making our schools, our communities, and our whole country healthier, more educated, and more prepared to live a fulfilling life and to face challenges with resilience. Principals, teachers, restorative practice coordinators, and counselors, our mission is so complicated and so important, and the clock is always ticking. If we think on a national scale of what it is that we need from schools, we need to help our students become competitive on a global stage in an age when population is burgeoning, but the numbers of entry-level jobs and low-skilled jobs are decreasing. When the need for students to understand more complicated topics and to go through several stages of retraining throughout a lifetime is at an all-time high. That means that we need to serve our students with skill development right now. And we don't have a day to waste. And when we feel the day is slipping away to disruption, we know that our students aren't really winning, even though they might feel satisfied that they conquered the classroom for the moment. But communication is the key. If we're going to pass the torch of all that we leaders of the schools have taken from past generations and from our current generation of colleagues,
and share it with students and welcome them into our great inheritance of learning. We're going to have to be able to share a dialogue with them, a dialogue that has continuity, a dialogue that steeps them in states of flow that benefit them as they try to create their own paths forward in life. And what we've seen is that the modern classroom is simply so distraction prone in thousands of schools across the country in such a way that makes interpersonal relationships very difficult, even traumatizing. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We can use technology in what is actually a relatively simple way to reset the stage for interpersonal interactions at a baseline of daily positivity, which enables us to work upward from there. Meanwhile, giving students contact with our superpower, and that is the beauty of content that we are prepared to share with them and to discover what they might then do once they've acquired it. The possibilities for classrooms around the country are changing because of the availability of this simple technique. And this technique can be transformational for you, especially if you can use it in concert with colleagues in your building, making the labor of this work easier, but many times more effective. Again, if you would like to talk more about how to tune the ideas that you've learned in this module to the particular needs of your classroom, school, and student population, please feel free to contact me. It would be a joy to work with you in an online conference or even in a site visit that we could arrange so that we could work in person through observations and face-to-face conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today for Focus and Flow, and I wish you the very best in your enterprise with students.